I'm really so grateful that you take the time to watch these videos. It makes me feel truly glad that you're here. But I've noticed not many of you are subscribing, liking, or commenting, and that can be a little disheartening. These stories deserve more than just silent viewers. They deserve a community of people who care. So, if you're watching from cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, Houston, or anywhere else, please take a moment to hit subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment with your city and what time it is where you're watching. Your support truly makes a difference. These stories matter, and together, we can make sure they get the attention they deserve. Thank you for being a part of this. When darkness descended upon the high-rise apartments of London and Guelph, Ontario, death climbed through the shadows. 15 stories above the unsuspecting city streets, a predator scaled concrete walls with the calculated precision of a spider ascending its web. Russell Maurice Johnson used his physical strength to scale the outsides of buildings as high as 15 stories, going from balcony to balcony, looking for an unlocked door. What emerged from those moonless nights was a reign of terror so meticulously orchestrated that even death itself wore the mask of natural causes. 7 women would fall victim to the man who transformed their sanctuaries into slaughterhouses, their bedrooms into tombs. This is the chilling chronicle of the bedroom strangler, a killer whose obsession with cleanliness was matched only by his insatiable hunger for the ultimate violation. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you enjoy these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for something truly chilling and tragic. We'll be telling 5 different true crime stories in this video, each one more haunting than the last. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, feel free to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready. This is the story The Bedroom Strangler, Russell Maurice Johnson. The year was 1973, and evil had found its climbing boots. Russell Maurice Johnson emerged from the psychiatric shadows of London, Ontario, like a nightmare given form. Standing tall with the physique of a bodybuilder and the face of a matinee idol, Johnson possessed a darkness that writhed behind his charming exterior. He was once a handsome man with a great physique, a bodybuilder and auto worker. Yet this powerful frame would become the instrument of unimaginable horror, a weapon forged in the fires of sexual deviancy and murderous compulsion. The autumn of 1973 brought with it more than falling leaves. It brought the first whisper of death to the quiet residential towers of London. Mary Catherine Hicks, a woman whose only crime was existing within Johnson's hunting ground, became the inaugural sacrifice to his twisted appetites. On that fateful October night, as the city slept in blissful ignorance, Johnson's deadly pilgrimage began with the methodical precision of a ritual. The killer's modus operandi was as terrifying as it was ingenious. He would get a weird urge to kill, climb a balcony, find a victim, and just start strangling. He would then tidy up. This compulsive cleanliness became Johnson's signature, transforming crime scenes into macabre tableaus that fooled even seasoned coroners into believing they were witnessing natural deaths rather than calculated murder. Johnson's hunting grounds stretched across London and Guelph, Ontario, where unsuspecting women lived their lives unaware that death watched them from the darkness beyond their balcony doors. His MO was to climb into the homes of women through unlocked balcony doors. The early to mid-1970s represented a more innocent time, when residents on the 15th floor believed height equated to safety. They never imagined that evil could scale walls like a predatory creature ascending to its prey. Mary Catherine Hicks discovered this horrifying truth in the most final way possible. Johnson's first murder was Mary Catherine Hicks in October 1973. She was found in her bed, in a natural sleeping position. Her death was attributed to an allergic reaction to medication. But this peaceful scene was nothing more than Johnson's meticulous staging. The reality was far more sinister. Johnson had infiltrated her sanctuary, watched her sleep with the patient hunger of a predator, then ended her life with surgical precision. The positioning of Hicks's body revealed Johnson's disturbing attention to detail. She was found with a pillow partially covering her face. This subtle evidence, overlooked by investigators at the time, represented Johnson's first attempt at creating the perfect crime scene. His obsessive-compulsive tendencies, which manifested in washing his hands 15 times daily, now served a more deadly purpose: the complete sanitization of murder. The death of Mary Catherine Hicks sent no shockwaves through the community because no one realized a killer walked among them. Johnson's genius lay not in his brutality, but in his invisibility. He had committed the perfect murder, one so clean and calculated that it appeared to be nothing more than a tragic accident. The killer had learned to make death itself his accomplice. As November's chill settled over London, Ontario, Johnson's hunger grew more insatiable. The successful murder of Mary Hicks had unlocked something primal within him, a beast that demanded feeding with increasing frequency. The apartment buildings that pierced the city skyline became his hunting preserve, each balcony a potential gateway to his next victim. Alice Jane Ralston became Johnson's second sacrifice to the altar of his twisted desires. Alice Jane Ralston was found dead in her apartment on November 30th, 1973. There were no obvious signs of trauma. Her death was attributed to hardened arteries. She was 27 years old, a life cut short by hands that had perfected the art of strangling without leaving obvious evidence. Johnson's technique was evolving, his methods becoming more refined with each kill. The ease with which Johnson dispatched his victims spoke to a terrifying reality. He possessed both the physical strength and psychological cunning to kill with impunity. His background as an auto worker had given him powerful hands that could manipulate machinery with precision, and now those same hands were manipulating the delicate mechanics of human mortality. But Johnson's crimes extended far beyond simple murder. His psychological profile revealed a mind fractured by sexual deviancy, a condition that had driven him to voluntarily commit himself to a psychiatric hospital in 1969. In 1969, Johnson voluntarily entered a London psychiatric hospital for treatment. It was for sexual deviancy. Treatment did not work. The therapeutic interventions had failed catastrophically, unleashing rather than containing the monster within. Johnson sexually assaulted almost a dozen women who survived his attacks before escalating to murder. These surviving victims provided a glimpse into Johnson's predatory patterns, revealing a man who combined sexual violence with an almost supernatural ability to infiltrate secured spaces. The media, grappling with reports of these mysterious assaults, dubbed the unknown perpetrator the bedroom strangler and the balcony rapist. The winter months brought no respite from Johnson's campaign of terror. As 1973 melted into 1974, his confidence grew alongside his body count. The successful murders of Mary Hicks and Alice Ralston had proven that his methods were virtually undetectable, transforming him into a phantom killer who could strike without consequence. March 1974 witnessed Johnson's third act of calculated murder. Eleanor Diane Hartwick became another casualty in his escalating war against innocent women. When Eleanor Diane Hartwick died in March 1974, her death was attributed to a reaction to prescription drugs. Johnson had posed her with a book in her hand, as if she had fallen asleep in bed. This macabre staging demonstrated Johnson's evolution as a killer. He was no longer content with simple strangulation. He had become an artist of death, crafting scenes that told false stories of peaceful endings. The image of Eleanor Hartwick, posed with a book as if she had simply dozed off while reading, represented the ultimate violation. Johnson had not merely taken her life. He had rewritten her death, transforming her final moments into a lie that would deceive investigators and comfort her family. The cruel irony was that her loved ones would remember her as having died peacefully, never knowing the terror she had experienced in her final breaths. Johnson's meticulous attention to crime scene details revealed the mind of a methodical killer. He was very good at tidying and cleaning the scenes. Coroners ruled the deaths of Johnson's first 3 victims were all accidental or natural causes. This supernatural ability to sanitize murder scenes spoke to Johnson's deep-seated psychological compulsions. His obsessive cleanliness, A trait that might have seemed benign in another context became the cornerstone of his killing methodology. The spring of 1974 brought blooming flowers and fresh horrors. Johnson's fourth victim, Doris Dodie Ethel Brown, would mark a disturbing escalation in his murderous evolution. Doris Dodie Ethel Brown lived with her children after divorcing her husband of 30 years. Brown was found in bed by one of her children with the blankets tucked up under her chin. The image of a child discovering their mother's lifeless body, carefully arranged by a killer to appear at peace, adds another layer of cruelty to Johnson's crimes. Brown's death was attributed to pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs. She had blood in her throat and rectum. She had been sexually assaulted after death. This marked Johnson's descent into necrophilia, revealing new depths of depravity that would characterize his later murders. The presence of blood in intimate areas indicated a level of post-mortem violence that transformed Johnson from a methodical strangler into something far more monstrous. The evolution of Johnson's crimes reflected a killer losing control of his carefully constructed facade. The killer was changing his behavior. Brown was murdered in a way that police still did not know they were dealing with a killer. Even with increasingly violent acts, Johnson's ability to mask his crimes remained intact, allowing him to continue his reign of terror undetected. As 1974 progressed, the shadow cast by Johnson's crimes began to darken the lives of countless women across London and Guelph. The randomness of his victim selection meant that every woman living in a high-rise apartment had become a potential target. Sleep became a luxury fraught with danger, and unlocked balcony doors transformed from ventilation sources into invitations for death. The psychological impact of Johnson's crimes extended far beyond his direct victims. The survivors of his sexual assaults lived with the knowledge that they had encountered pure evil and escaped with their lives. These women carried the burden of understanding that somewhere in their city, a predator roamed free, scaling buildings and infiltrating bedrooms with the casual efficiency of a supernatural entity. Law enforcement agencies found themselves chasing shadows and investigating deaths that appeared to be anything but murders. Johnson's criminal genius lay in his ability to kill in plain sight while remaining completely invisible to the very people tasked with stopping him. Each natural death was filed away, each grieving family comforted by the apparent peacefulness of their loved one's passing, while Johnson walked free to plan his next descent into horror. The year 1974 would conclude with Johnson having successfully murdered 4 women while maintaining his facade of respectability. To his co-workers at the auto plant, he remained Russell the bodybuilder, the handsome colleague who kept to himself. To his neighbors, he was simply another face in the crowd. But in the darkness that cloaked the apartment buildings of Ontario, he had become something else entirely. A specter of death that climbed through shadows and strangled dreams. As 1974 faded into memory, Johnson's appetite for death had grown beyond mere sustenance. It had become an addiction that demanded increasingly elaborate feeding rituals. The killer who had once been content with simple strangulation now craved theatrical presentations of mortality, transforming each murder into a carefully orchestrated performance where death played the starring role. The winter months provided Johnson with extended hours of darkness, cloaking his movements as he navigated the urban jungle of high-rise apartments. His physical prowess had not diminished. If anything, his confidence in scaling impossible heights had grown with each successful kill. He once scaled a building balcony to the 15th floor, only to find the balcony doors locked. This single anecdote reveals the terrifying persistence that drove Johnson's crimes: 15 stories of vertical climbing, driven by an insatiable need to penetrate his victims' sanctuaries. The methodology behind Johnson's infiltrations represented a masterclass in predatory behavior. He had studied his hunting grounds with the dedication of a military strategist, identifying patterns in his victims' routines and exploiting the universal human need for fresh air that kept balcony doors unlocked even in the dead of winter. Each building became a fortress to be conquered, each apartment a prize to be claimed through violence. New Year's Eve 1974 should have been a celebration of new beginnings and fresh hope. Instead, it became the date of Johnson's most elaborate and psychologically disturbing murder yet. Diane Beats, 23 years old and engaged to be married, became the victim of Johnson's escalating brutality. Just a few days before her death, Diane Beats, 23, received a delivery of flowers from an unknown stranger. These flowers, seemingly innocent tokens of admiration, now take on a sinister significance as potential calling cards from a stalker preparing for murder. She was strangled on New Year's Eve, 1974. She and her fiancé became engaged the night before he found her body in her home. The timing of this murder reveals Johnson's capacity for ultimate cruelty. Diane had experienced the pinnacle of human happiness, an engagement to her beloved, only to have her life extinguished within hours by hands that showed no mercy for love, hope, or dreams of the future. The method of Diane's murder marked a significant escalation in Johnson's violence. She was strangled with her bra. Her hands were bound behind her with a nylon. Johnson had bound and sexually assaulted the corpse. The use of Diane's own clothing as a murder weapon added a layer of intimate violation to an already heinous crime. The binding of her hands suggested a killer who had evolved beyond simple strangulation to embrace torture and prolonged suffering as part of his ritual. The necrophilic assault that followed Diane's murder represented Johnson's complete abandonment of whatever humanity might have once existed within him. He had crossed the final threshold from killer to monster, transforming death itself into an opportunity for the ultimate violation. This post-mortem assault would become Johnson's signature, a grotesque calling card that separated him from mere murderers and elevated him to the ranks of the truly depraved. Before the discovery of her body, Johnson had called police to the area as a ruse. This detail reveals the psychological complexity of Johnson's crimes. He had become so confident in his abilities that he now played games with law enforcement, positioning himself as both predator and observer of his own crime's aftermath. The act of calling police to discover his victim's body demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that bordered on the supernatural. The discovery of Diane Beats's body sent the first real shockwaves through the London community. Unlike Johnson's previous victims, whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes, Diane's murder bore the unmistakable hallmarks of violence. The ligature marks around her neck, the evidence of sexual assault, and the obvious staging of the crime scene finally alerted authorities to the presence of a serial killer in their midst. At the time, the investigation into the slayings was the largest in London's history. Law enforcement agencies mobilized with unprecedented urgency, recognizing that they were dealing with a predator whose capabilities far exceeded those of common criminals. The realization that previous natural deaths might have been murders sent investigators scrambling to re-examine cold cases and connect dots that had remained invisible for years. The investigation revealed patterns that should have been obvious in retrospect but had been obscured by Johnson's meticulous staging. Young women living alone in high-rise apartments, deaths occurring without obvious causes, and the complete absence of signs of forced entry all pointed to a killer with both supernatural climbing abilities and an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on the pathological. Media coverage of the murders introduced the terrifying concept of the bedroom strangler to the public consciousness. Citizens who had once felt secure in their high-rise sanctuaries now found themselves checking and double-checking locks, installing additional security measures, and sleeping fitfully with the knowledge that height was no protection against this particular predator. The psychological impact of Johnson's crimes rippled through entire communities, transforming every unlocked door into a potential gateway for death. As 1975 dawned, Johnson's crimes had evolved from a series of mysterious deaths into a full-blown reign of terror. The killer who had once relied on invisibility now found himself the subject of the largest manhunt in London's history. Yet he remained as elusive as ever. His physical capabilities continued to give him advantages that traditional criminals could never possess, allowing him to access victims in ways that defied conventional security measures. The period following Diane Beats's murder witnessed a temporary lull in Johnson's killing activities, though this respite provided no comfort to law enforcement or the terrified citizenry. Experienced investigators understood that serial killers rarely simply stopped. They evolved, adapted, and prepared for their next phase of violence. Johnson's silence during this period suggested a predator who was studying the increased security measures, learning from the heightened awareness of his presence, and planning his next moves with characteristic precision. During this investigative period, authorities began to piece together the true scope of Johnson's crimes. Johnson sexually assaulted almost a dozen women who survived his attacks, providing law enforcement with their first real glimpse into the killer's methodology. These survivors painted a picture of a man who combined physical prowess with psychological manipulation, using his strength to overpower victims while employing cleanup rituals that suggested deep-seated compulsive disorders. The survivor testimonies revealed Johnson's evolution from sexual predator to murderer. His early crimes had involved breaking and entering, sexual assault, and meticulous cleaning of crime scenes before departure. The progression to murder appeared to be a natural escalation for a predator whose needs could no longer be satisfied by assault alone. Each crime had fed his hunger while simultaneously increasing his appetite for more extreme violations. Psychological profilers working the case began to construct a picture of a killer whose compulsions were driven by complex mental disorders. Johnson's obsessive cleanliness, his need to tidy up after murders, and his ability to transform crime scenes into elaborate theatrical presentations suggested a mind that operated according to its own twisted logic. These insights would prove crucial in understanding not just what Johnson did, but why he did it with such methodical precision. The investigation also revealed the inadequacies of 1970s forensic science in dealing with a killer of Johnson's sophistication. His ability to strangle victims without leaving obvious evidence, combined with his meticulous scene cleanup, had rendered traditional investigative techniques largely useless. The absence of fingerprints, DNA evidence, not yet available, and obvious signs of struggle had allowed Johnson to commit multiple murders while remaining completely invisible to law enforcement. As 1975 progressed without additional murders, some within the community began to hope that the killer had moved on, died, or been arrested for other crimes. These hopes represented the desperate desire of a traumatized population to believe that their nightmare had ended. Unfortunately, those familiar with serial killer psychology understood that Johnson's silence likely indicated planning rather than cessation. The media coverage during this period transformed Johnson from a local threat into a national figure. The bedroom strangler became a household name across Canada, representing every parent's worst nightmare and every woman's deepest fear. The fact that he could scale buildings and penetrate locked homes had elevated him beyond the realm of ordinary criminals into something approaching urban legend. Law enforcement agencies across Ontario began reviewing unsolved cases, searching for signs of Johnson's methodology in deaths that might have been mistakenly attributed to natural causes. This retrospective investigation revealed the true genius of Johnson's early crimes. By making murder appear natural, he had effectively erased himself from investigative consideration until his methods evolved to include more obvious violence. The psychological impact on Johnson's surviving victims during this period cannot be overstated. These women lived with the knowledge that they had encountered pure evil and escaped with their lives. Yet they also understood that their attacker remained free to strike again. The randomness of Johnson's victim selection meant that survival had been a matter of luck rather than preparation, leaving survivors with the haunting knowledge that they could easily have been among the dead. As 1976 dawned, the investigation into the bedroom strangler had consumed enormous resources while producing frustratingly few concrete leads. Johnson's ability to remain invisible while committing increasingly violent crimes had challenged every assumption about criminal behavior and investigative methodology. The killer who had begun as a sexual predator had evolved into something far more dangerous, a phantom who could strike anywhere, anytime, and disappear without leaving a trace. The year 1977 would prove to be Russell Maurice Johnson's swan song, a crescendo of violence that would finally expose the monster hiding behind his carefully constructed facade. After years of operating in the shadows, scaling impossible heights and strangling dreams in their sleep, Johnson's compulsions had evolved beyond his ability to control them. The meticulous killer who had once made murder appear natural was about to reveal himself as something far more monstrous. April 15, 1977, marked the beginning of Johnson's final act of terror. Luella Jean George, whose only crime was living within reach of a predator, became Johnson's sixth confirmed victim. On April 15, 1977, Johnson strangled Luella Jean George in her fourth-floor home. He made her bed to try to cover the crime. The irony of a killer attempting to hide his crimes through domestic tidiness speaks to the profound psychological fractures that drove Johnson's behavior. The positioning of Luella's apartment on the fourth floor demonstrates that Johnson's climbing abilities remained as supernatural as ever. While 4 stories might seem manageable compared to his previous 15-story ascent, the psychological impact of knowing that no height provided safety from this predator cannot be understated. Johnson had transformed every balcony in London and Guelph into a potential crime scene. She was strangled to death, then sexually assaulted. Johnson stole some underwear and jewelry but disposed of them in the area. The theft of intimate items reveals another layer of Johnson's depravity. The fact that he discarded these trophies nearby suggests either supreme confidence in his ability to avoid detection or a compulsion that overrode his usual careful planning. These discarded items would eventually become crucial evidence in his capture. George was found by a coworker after not showing up to work at the hospital across the street. The cruel irony that Luella worked at a hospital, a place dedicated to healing and preserving life, while living directly across from her eventual murderer adds another layer of tragedy to her death. Johnson had claimed a victim whose professional mission was to save lives, transforming her home into a tomb that overlooked her workplace. The discovery of Luella's body marked a turning point in the investigation. Unlike Johnson's earlier victims, whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes, Luella's murder bore obvious signs of violence that could not be explained away. The evidence of strangulation, sexual assault, and theft created a clear pattern that investigators could finally begin to follow. As spring melted into summer, Johnson's psychological state appeared to be deteriorating rapidly. The careful planning and meticulous cleanup that had characterized his earlier crimes were giving way to increasing violence and decreasing caution. This evolution suggested a killer who was losing control of the very compulsions that had made him so successful at avoiding detection. July 1977 would witness Johnson's final and most disturbing crime, an act of violence so extreme that it would finally lead to his capture. His 7th and final victim would be Donna Veldboom, a woman whose proximity to Johnson would prove to be her death sentence. In July 1977, Johnson changed his pattern again when he attacked Donna Veldboom. This change in methodology suggested a killer who had abandoned his careful planning in favor of immediate gratification. He cut Veldboom across the chest. He said later he wanted to crawl inside her to be warm and safe. This statement, extracted from Johnson after his capture, reveals the profound psychological fractures that drove his crimes. The desire to literally merge with his victims through violence speaks to a level of mental disturbance that transcends ordinary criminal psychology and enters the realm of the truly pathological. The cutting of Donna Veldboom represented Johnson's complete abandonment of his previous methodology. Where once he had relied on strangulation that left minimal evidence, he had now escalated to knife violence that left unmistakable signs of his presence. This shift suggested either a complete psychological break or a subconscious desire to finally be caught and stopped. After death, she was sexually assaulted, bathed, and posed. She lived in the same building as the killer. The proximity of victim to killer adds a chilling dimension to this final murder. Johnson had literally brought death home, claiming a victim from his own building in an act that suggested either supreme arrogance or complete loss of rational thought. The bathing and posing of the corpse maintained Johnson's signature attention to post-mortem presentation while revealing the depths of his necrophilic compulsions. The fact that Johnson had murdered someone from his own building created an immediate trail that investigators could follow. Unlike his previous crimes, where victim selection appeared random, this murder occurred within Johnson's own sphere of daily life. The proximity would prove to be his downfall, providing investigators with their first real opportunity to connect the killer to a specific location and group of suspects. Police finally arrested Russell Maurice Johnson on July 28, 1977. The capture of the bedroom strangler sent shockwaves throughout Ontario and beyond. After years of terrorizing communities and scaling impossible heights to commit unspeakable crimes, Johnson's reign of terror had finally ended. The man who had seemed supernatural in his ability to avoid detection had been reduced to a suspect in handcuffs. The arrest of Russell Maurice Johnson revealed the banality of evil in its purest form. The monster who had climbed through nightmares and strangled innocents was, in the harsh light of day, simply a man with powerful hands and fractured psychology. His capture demonstrated that even the most sophisticated predators eventually make mistakes that lead to their downfall. After his July 1977 arrest, Johnson pleads not guilty on charges of first-degree murder for Veldboom, Beets, and George. The decision to charge Johnson with only 3 of his 7 confirmed murders speaks to the challenges of prosecuting a killer whose early crimes had been so successfully disguised as natural deaths. The evidence linking Johnson to Mary Hicks, Alice Ralston, Eleanor Hartwick, and Doris Brown remained largely circumstantial despite investigators' certainty about his guilt. He was not charged with the other murders, leaving 4 families without legal justice for their loved ones' deaths. This prosecutorial decision reflected the harsh realities of 1970s forensic science and the challenges of proving murders that had been so meticulously staged to appear natural. Johnson's early victims would remain officially unvindicated, their deaths classified as natural despite the overwhelming evidence of their true manner of death. Despite pleading not guilty, Johnson had given an unsigned statement to police. It was admitted as evidence during his trial. This statement would provide investigators and prosecutors with crucial insights into Johnson's methodology and psychology, filling in gaps that physical evidence had been unable to address. The fact that Johnson had confessed, even without signing his statement, suggested either arrogance or a subconscious desire for acknowledgement of his crimes. The trial of Russell Maurice Johnson became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Canadian history. The man who had terrorized communities for years would finally face justice for his crimes, though the legal system would ultimately prove inadequate to address the full scope of his atrocities. The courtroom became a theater where the monster would finally be fully exposed to public scrutiny. On February 1, 1978, Johnson is found not guilty by reason of insanity. This verdict, while legally appropriate given Johnson's documented mental illness, provided little comfort to the families of his victims or the communities he had terrorized. The finding meant that Johnson would be confined to a mental institution rather than prison, raising questions about whether justice had truly been served. He has been in a maximum security mental hospital since February 1978. Johnson's commitment to psychiatric care represented society's attempt to address both his mental illness and the public safety threat he represented. The maximum security classification acknowledged that despite his insanity defense, Johnson remained extremely dangerous and required permanent isolation from potential victims. The psychiatric evaluation of Johnson following his conviction revealed the full extent of his mental disorders. Psychiatrists described Johnson as a sexual sadist, lust murderer, and necrophile. This clinical assessment provided official confirmation of what investigators had suspected throughout their pursuit of the bedroom strangler. They had been hunting a predator whose compulsions extended far beyond ordinary criminal behavior. The treatment of Johnson within the mental health system would prove as controversial as his crimes had been shocking. Around 2005, he began chemical castration with Luprin. This reversible treatment lowers testosterone and turned down the volume of sexualized thinking. The use of chemical castration represented the medical community's attempt to address the biological components of Johnson's sexual violence, though the effectiveness of such treatments remained debatable. Then, with therapy, the user can change his or her sexually deviant behavior. Johnson does not want to change his behavior. This resistance to treatment revealed the fundamental challenge of dealing with predators like Johnson. Despite decades of confinement and medical intervention, he remained fundamentally unchanged in his desires and attitudes toward his crimes. The monster that had climbed through shadows remained unrepentant and unreformed. The revelation that Johnson refused to participate meaningfully in his own rehabilitation raised troubling questions about the purpose and effectiveness of his continued confinement. If he could not be cured and refused to cooperate with treatment, his institutionalization served purely as protective custody for society rather than therapeutic intervention for his benefit. In August 2019, he applied for leniency and was denied because he thinks he is fine as he is and does not need to change. This application, made more than 40 years after his crimes, demonstrated that Johnson's fundamental psychology remained unchanged despite decades of confinement and treatment. His belief that he required no change suggested a complete absence of remorse or insight into the harm he had caused. He applies every year for some kind of leniency such as escorted passes and medium security. He is denied every year. Johnson's persistent applications for reduced security suggest a man who continues to view his confinement as temporary and unjustified rather than necessary protection for society. The consistent denial of these applications reflects the ongoing assessment that Johnson remains as dangerous as ever. The consideration of Johnson's physical capabilities adds another layer to these security decisions. This is from a guy who could climb 15 stories with his bare hands. The reminder of Johnson's supernatural climbing abilities serves as a stark warning that any reduction in his security level could potentially result in escape and renewed violence. The predator who had once scaled impossible heights might still possess the capability to breach conventional security measures. The confinement of Russell Maurice Johnson within the sterile walls of a maximum security mental hospital marked not the end of his story, but rather the beginning of a different kind of horror, the endless contemplation of what evil looks like when caged but never truly contained. Behind reinforced doors and constant surveillance, the man who had once scaled impossible heights and strangled dreams remained as dangerous and unrepentant as the night he first climbed toward his victims' balconies. Decades passed within the institutional corridors where Johnson resided, each year marked by the anniversary of crimes that had forever changed the landscape of fear in Ontario. The bedroom strangler had become a ghost story made flesh, a cautionary tale whispered in the darkness of high-rise apartments where residents still checked their locks twice before sleep. Yet, for all the security measures and psychiatric interventions, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Had the monster been contained or merely relocated? The psychiatric reports that accumulated in Johnson's file painted a picture of a man fundamentally unchanged by his confinement. Psychiatrists describe Johnson as a sexual sadist, lust murderer, and necrophile. These clinical designations, cold and precise in their medical terminology, failed to capture the true horror of what Johnson represented, a predator whose compulsions remained as powerful and destructive as ever, constrained only by physical barriers rather than any genuine transformation of character. The introduction of chemical castration therapy in 2005 represented the medical establishment's most aggressive attempt to address the biological foundations of Johnson's violence. Around 2005, he began chemical castration with Lupron. This reversible treatment lowers testosterone and turns down the volume of sexualized thinking. The very existence of such treatments acknowledged the horrifying reality that traditional therapeutic interventions had proven inadequate in addressing predators of Johnson's caliber. Yet even this radical medical intervention came with the recognition that its success depended entirely upon the patient's willingness to participate in his own rehabilitation. Then, with therapy, the user can change his or her sexually deviant behavior. Johnson does not want to change his behavior. This resistance to treatment revealed the fundamental challenge posed by predators like Johnson. How does society address individuals who possess both the capacity for extreme violence and the absolute refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing or seek redemption? The annual ritual of Johnson's applications for reduced security became a macabre dance between a predator seeking freedom and a system designed to protect society from his continued threat. In August 2019, he applied for leniency and was denied because he thinks he is fine as he is and does not need to change. This application, submitted more than 40 years after his final murder, demonstrated the terrifying persistence of Johnson's self-perception as a victim rather than a perpetrator. He applies every year for some kind of leniency such as escorted passes and medium security. He is denied every year. Each application represented not hope for rehabilitation, but rather evidence of Johnson's continued belief that his confinement was unjustified. The consistent pattern of denial by review boards reflected an understanding that the passage of time had done nothing to diminish the fundamental danger Johnson represented to society. The consideration of Johnson's physical capabilities added a chilling dimension to these security assessments. This is from a guy who could climb 15 stories with his bare hands. The reminder of Johnson's supernatural physical abilities served as a stark warning that conventional security measures might prove inadequate against a predator who had once scaled impossible heights with the casual ease of a spider ascending its web. Even in his 70s, Johnson remained a physical threat whose capabilities transcended those of ordinary criminals. The psychological evaluations conducted throughout Johnson's confinement revealed a mind that had crystallized around its original pathology rather than evolving toward health. The compulsions that had driven him to scale buildings and strangle innocents remained as powerful as ever, contained only by physical barriers rather than any genuine transformation of desire or intent. The monster that had terrorized Ontario in the 1970s continued to exist unchanged within the shell of an aging man. The institutional staff tasked with managing Johnson's daily existence faced the unique challenge of containing a predator whose crimes had transcended ordinary criminal behavior to become legendary examples of human evil. Every interaction, every routine procedure, every moment of his supervised existence required acknowledgement that they were dealing with someone capable of unimaginable violence if given even the slightest opportunity to act upon his unchanged compulsions. The families of Johnson's victims found themselves trapped in their own form of life sentence, forever bound to the man who had destroyed their loved ones through the legal requirement that they be notified of his periodic applications for reduced security. Each year brought fresh reminders of their loss, accompanied by the terrifying possibility that the killer might somehow be granted the freedom to strike again. Mary Catherine Hicks, Alice Jane Ralston, Eleanor Diane Hartwick, Doris Brown, Diane Beats, Luella George, and Donna Veldboom. These names became more than mere statistics in criminal justice files. They represented dreams extinguished, futures stolen, and families forever shattered by a predator whose hunger for death had transformed their sanctuaries into slaughterhouses. Their memory served as both memorial and warning, testament to the reality that evil could climb any wall and penetrate any security with sufficient determination. The broader impact of Johnson's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to encompass an entire generation of women who learned to live with the knowledge that height provided no protection from predators willing to scale impossible obstacles in pursuit of their prey. Balcony doors that had once remained unlocked for fresh air became potential gateways for death, forever changing the relationship between urban dwellers and their supposed sanctuaries. The investigative techniques developed during the hunt for the bedroom strangler revolutionized law enforcement's approach to serial killer cases, though they came too late to prevent Johnson's reign of terror. The recognition that staged crime scenes could disguise murder as natural death led to new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths, potentially saving countless future victims from predators who might have followed Johnson's methodology. The media coverage that had transformed Johnson from local threat to national nightmare established patterns that would influence crime reporting for decades to come. The creation of dramatic monikers like the bedroom strangler and the balcony rapist demonstrated both the public's need to name and categorize evil and the danger of inadvertently romanticizing predators through sensationalized coverage. The legal precedent established by Johnson's insanity defense raised fundamental questions about society's obligation to treat versus punish individuals whose mental illness manifested in extreme violence. His case became a touchstone for debates about criminal responsibility, the effectiveness of psychiatric treatment for sexual predators, and the appropriate balance between rehabilitation and public safety. The psychiatric community's ongoing struggle to understand and treat individuals like Johnson exposed the limitations of both medical intervention and therapeutic philosophy when confronted with predators who actively resisted change. The recognition that some individuals might be fundamentally untreatable challenged core assumptions about human nature and the possibility of redemption for even the most heinous criminals. As the decades accumulated around Johnson's confinement, the questions raised by his case remained as relevant as ever. What does society owe to victims whose murders had been so successfully disguised that justice remained incomplete? How should communities balance the rights of the mentally ill against the safety of potential victims? Can evil be contained indefinitely, or does it eventually find new expressions regardless of physical constraints? The ongoing existence of Russell Maurice Johnson within the mental health system served as a constant reminder that some forms of evil cannot be cured, only contained. His persistent applications for reduced security demonstrated that the compulsions driving his crimes remained as powerful as ever, waiting for any opportunity to express themselves through renewed violence. The institutional knowledge accumulated through decades of managing Johnson became crucial intelligence for handling future predators whose crimes transcended ordinary criminal behavior. The understanding that some individuals required permanent containment regardless of their mental health status influenced policies and procedures that would protect countless future victims from similar predators. The shadow cast by Johnson's crimes extended beyond his immediate victims to encompass an entire society's understanding of vulnerability and evil. The recognition that predators could literally scale walls to reach their victims transformed architectural considerations for residential buildings, and influenced security designs that prioritized protection from threats that could approach from previously unimaginable angles. The technological advances that emerged in the decades following Johnson's capture. DNA analysis, improved forensic techniques, enhanced communication systems, represented tools that might have shortened his reign of terror if they had been available during the 1970s. Yet they also served as reminders that evil adapts to technological change, requiring constant vigilance and innovation from those tasked with protecting society. The educational value of Johnson's case extended throughout law enforcement, mental health, and criminology communities, providing crucial insights into the methodology and psychology of predators whose capabilities exceeded those of conventional criminals. His crimes became case studies in the importance of recognizing patterns that might otherwise be dismissed as coincidental or natural. The literary and academic attention focused on Johnson's crimes ensured that the lessons learned from his case would continue to influence understanding of serial killer behavior long after his eventual death. Russell Maurice Johnson has not been written about as the sole subject of a book. Johnson is covered in Canadian Monsters, 25 Horrific Canadian Serial Killers by Robert Keller, and appears in several other academic and popular works examining Canadian serial murder. As Johnson aged within the confines of maximum security psychiatric care, the question of his eventual fate became increasingly relevant. Would he die in confinement, taking his secrets and unrepentant attitudes to the grave? Would advancing age and physical decline eventually render him harmless? Or would the compulsions that had driven his crimes find new expressions adapted to his changing capabilities? The ongoing cost of Johnson's confinement, financial, emotional, and social, represented society's investment in preventing future victims while maintaining its commitment to treating rather than simply warehousing the mentally ill. Each year of his continued existence required justification of resources that might otherwise be directed toward prevention, treatment, or support for other vulnerable populations. The ultimate legacy of Russell Maurice Johnson remained unwritten as long as he drew breath within the institutional walls that contained him. His story served simultaneously as historical record, cautionary tale, and ongoing reminder that evil could take forms that challenged every assumption about human nature and criminal behavior. The bedroom strangler had been caged, but the questions raised by his existence would endure long after his eventual death, continuing to influence how society understood and addressed the most extreme expressions of human depravity. The 7 women whose lives Johnson had stolen, Mary Catherine Hicks, Alice Jane Ralston, Eleanor Diane Hartwick, Doris Brown, Diane Beats, Luella George, and Donna Veldbom, remained frozen in time, their potential contributions to the world forever unknown. Their memory served as both memorial to lives cut short and motivation for the continued vigilance required to prevent similar tragedies from befalling future generations of innocent victims. In the end, the story of Russell Maurice Johnson represented more than the chronicle of a serial killer's crimes and capture. It embodied society's ongoing struggle to comprehend and contain evil while maintaining its commitment to justice, treatment, and the protection of the innocent. The bedroom strangler had been stopped, but the shadow he cast would continue to influence how communities understood vulnerability, how law enforcement investigated suspicious deaths, and how mental health professionals approached the treatment of sexual predators whose compulsions transcended the boundaries of conventional therapy. The climb that had begun in the darkness of Ontario's high-rise apartments had finally ended not with a fall, but with permanent confinement behind walls that no amount of physical strength could scale. Yet the questions raised by Johnson's ascent into evil would continue to challenge society long after the predator himself had been rendered harmless by age, confinement, and the passage of time. The monster had been caged, but the lessons learned from his crimes would endure as essential knowledge for protecting future generations from predators whose evil knew no bounds and recognized no barriers save those imposed by constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to justice. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe. so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Kindly Killer. Dennis Nilsen's Reign of Terror. The stench of death clawed through London's winter air on February 8, 1983, when drain workers lifted a manhole cover on Cranley Gardens and discovered fragments of human flesh clogging the pipes. What they found would expose one of Britain's most chilling serial killers, a man who murdered not from rage or hatred, but from a twisted desire for eternal companionship. Dennis Nilsen didn't just kill his victims. He kept them, bathed them, dressed them, and lived with their decaying corpses for months, creating a macabre household where the living and the dead coexisted in his warped reality. For 5 horrific years, this soft-spoken civil servant prowled London's pubs and streets, his kind eyes and gentle demeanor masking the monster within. He offered warmth to the cold, food to the hungry, and shelter to the desperate, only to transform these acts of apparent compassion into death sentences. This is the story of Dennis Nilsen, the Muswell Hill murderer, whose victims trusted him with their lives and paid the ultimate price for that trust. The grey Scottish skies of Fraserburgh seemed to press down on the young Dennis Nilsen like a suffocating blanket, shaping the future killer in ways that wouldn't become clear until decades later. Born on November 23, 1945, Dennis Andrew Nilsen entered a world fractured by war and familial dysfunction, where love came wrapped in conditions and abandonment lurked around every corner. His earliest memories were painted in shades of loss and confusion. Dennis Nilsen was a Scottish serial killer and necrophile who murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983, but the seeds of his homicidal nature were planted long before his first kill. His father, Olav Magnus Nilsen, was a Norwegian soldier who had little time for his son, leaving young Dennis to be raised primarily by his stern, religious mother Betty and his beloved grandfather, Andrew White. The old fisherman became Dennis's anchor in a turbulent childhood, teaching him about the sea, about life, and about the natural order of things. But even this sanctuary crumbled when Andrew White died suddenly when Dennis was just 6 years old. The boy was brought to view his grandfather's corpse, and something twisted and dangerous awakened in his young mind as he stared at the peaceful face of death. The experience would haunt him forever, creating an obsession with mortality that would eventually consume him and his victims. School offered no refuge from his internal turmoil. Dennis was quiet, introspective, and different, traits that made him a target for bullies and further isolated him from his peers. He discovered early that he was attracted to men, a realization that filled him with shame and self-loathing in the conservative environment of 1950s Scotland. This secret burned within him like acid, eating away at his ability to form normal relationships and driving him deeper into the recesses of his own mind. The British Army became his escape route from the suffocating small-town atmosphere of Fraserburgh. At 17, Dennis enlisted, desperate to find purpose and perhaps discover who he truly was beyond the confines of his troubled childhood. The military structure initially provided him with the stability he craved, and he threw himself into his duties with remarkable dedication, eventually becoming a cook and rising to the rank of junior chef. But even in the army, Dennis couldn't escape himself. His homosexuality remained a dangerous secret that could end his military career in an instant. The constant need to hide his true nature created a pressure cooker effect in his psyche, building tension that would eventually find its release in the most horrific ways imaginable. His fellow soldiers saw him as reliable, quiet, and helpful, the same facade he would later use to lure his victims to their deaths. During his 11 years in the military, Dennis served in various locations, including a particularly significant posting in Aden, now Yemen, where the harsh realities of military life and death surrounded him daily. The sight of corpses became routine, mundane even, further desensitizing him to mortality and feeding his growing fascination with death. Fellow soldiers later recalled how Dennis seemed almost too comfortable around the deceased, showing an unnatural calm that should have been a warning sign. His army career ended in 1972, not in disgrace, but with a clean record and even some commendations. To the outside world, Dennis Nilsson appeared to be a model soldier transitioning into civilian life. The reality was far more sinister. He was a man whose deepest psychological wounds had festered in silence, creating a predator who understood how to blend seamlessly into society while harboring the darkest of intentions. London beckoned like a siren song, promising anonymity and opportunity in equal measure. The sprawling metropolis offered countless hunting grounds for a man with Dennis's twisted appetites. Gay bars, public toilets, parks, and streets filled with vulnerable young men looking for connection, work, or simply a place to belong. The city's indifference to individual suffering would provide the perfect camouflage for the horrors he was planning to unleash. He found work as a civil servant, first with the police and later with the Department of Employment, positions that required him to help people in need. The irony was lost on no one who later learned the full extent of his crimes. By day, he processed unemployment benefits and assisted job seekers. By night, he cruised the capital's underbelly, searching for his next victim. Dennis settled into a ground-floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, North London. The property would become his primary killing ground, a chamber of horrors disguised as a modest family home. The flat came with a garden, a detail that would prove crucial to his method of body disposal. To the neighbors, he appeared to be the ideal tenant. Quiet, clean, and always ready to lend a helping hand. His life fell into a routine that masked the growing violence brewing within him. He worked diligently at his government job, earning praise from supervisors for his attention to detail and compassionate handling of difficult cases. In the evenings, he would frequent the gay pubs and clubs of central London, nursing a drink and observing the crowd with the calculating eyes of a predator selecting prey. The loneliness that had plagued him since childhood intensified in London's urban jungle. Despite being surrounded by millions of people, Dennis felt more isolated than ever. This isolation wasn't just emotional, it was existential. He began to view other people not as fellow human beings, but as objects that could provide him with the companionship he craved, even if they had to be dead to do so. His first attempts at human connection were pathetic rather than criminal. He would pick up young men from bars and bring them home, desperately hoping to forge some kind of lasting bond. When they inevitably left in the morning, Dennis felt the familiar stab of abandonment that had haunted him since his grandfather's death. The pattern repeated itself countless times, each rejection deepening his resentment and strengthening his resolve to find a more permanent solution to his loneliness. The transformation from lonely civil servant to cold-blooded killer didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent into darkness, marked by increasingly violent fantasies and a growing detachment from reality. Dennis began to see murder not as a moral transgression, but as a practical solution to his emotional needs. If people wouldn't stay with him willingly, he would make them stay permanently. By late 1978, all the elements were in place for Dennis Nilsson to begin his killing spree. He had the location, the method, and most importantly, the psychological justification that allowed him to transform murder into an act of love in his twisted mind. The stage was set for one of Britain's most horrific serial killing campaigns, and Dennis was ready to claim his first victim. The quiet civil servant who helped unemployed people find work was about to become a monster who would rob at least 15 young men of their futures, their dreams, and their lives. The kindly facade that had served him so well was about to become the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal, more deadly than any ligature or knife because it inspired the trust that made murder possible. December 30th, 1978. The date would forever be etched into the annals of British criminal history as the moment Dennis Nilsson crossed the ultimate line from fantasy into horrific reality. The Christmas decorations still hung throughout London, twinkling with false cheer as the city prepared to welcome a new year. But for one young man, there would be no new year, no new beginnings, only a violent end in the modest flat on Melrose Avenue. His first known victim was 14-year-old Stephen Holmes on December 30th, 1978, though the boy's age has been disputed by various sources, with some records indicating he was closer to 16 or 17. Regardless of the exact number, Stephen Holmes was barely more than a child, a runaway seeking shelter from London's unforgiving streets during the harsh winter months. Dennis encountered Stephen in a pub in the West End, where the young man sat alone, nursing a pint with trembling hands that betrayed his desperation and inexperience. To the predator watching from across the room, Stephen represented the perfect victim. Isolated, vulnerable, and invisible to a society that had already forgotten him. Dennis approached with the practiced charm of a man who understood human weakness, offering warmth, food, and shelter to someone who had none. The journey back to Melrose Avenue must have seemed like salvation to Stephen Holmes. Here was a kind, well-dressed man offering genuine hospitality with no apparent strings attached. Dennis regaled him with stories, plied him with alcohol, and created an atmosphere of safety that would prove to be a deadly illusion. The flat itself was comfortable, decorated with care, and radiating the warmth that Stephen so desperately craved. But as the evening wore on and the alcohol took effect, something shifted in Dennis's demeanor. The mask of kindness began to slip, revealing the monster that lurked just beneath the surface. Perhaps it was the sight of Stephen preparing to leave, or maybe it was simply the culmination of months of violent fantasies demanding release. Whatever triggered the transformation, it was swift and merciless. Nilsson invited him back to his flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, strangled him with a necktie, and then drowned him in a bucket of water. The method was both brutal and intimate, requiring Dennis to be close enough to feel his victim's final breaths, to watch the light fade from his eyes, to experience the exact moment when life became death. The actual murder took place in Dennis's bedroom, where the pretense of hospitality finally dropped away entirely. Stephen, weakened by alcohol and caught completely off guard, offered little resistance to the necktie that tightened around his throat like a noose. The strangulation wasn't immediately fatal. Dennis wasn't yet practiced in the art of murder, and his technique was crude and inefficient. When the ligature failed to complete the job, Dennis dragged the semi-conscious boy to the kitchen, where he filled a bucket with water and forced Stephen's head beneath the surface. The drowning was prolonged and agonizing, with Dennis holding his victim's head down until the final bubble of air escaped his lungs and his body went completely still. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of absolute quiet that only death can bring. But Dennis's reaction to his first kill revealed the true depth of his psychological disturbance. Instead of panic, guilt, or revulsion, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if he had finally discovered his true purpose in life. The dead boy represented something Dennis had never possessed before. A companion who would never leave him, never reject him, never abandon him the way everyone else had throughout his life. He carried Stephen's lifeless body back to the bedroom and gently placed him on the bed, arranging his limbs in a peaceful pose that suggested sleep rather than death. Then, in an act that would become his horrific signature, Dennis began to care for the corpse as if it were still alive. He washed the body with tender attention, combed the hair, and even dressed Stephen in clean clothes from his own wardrobe. For several hours, Dennis sat beside the body, talking to it, touching it, and basking in the presence of his perfect companion. This wasn't necrophilia in the traditional sense, it was something far more disturbing. Dennis had created a relationship with death itself, transforming murder into a twisted form of love that satisfied his deepest psychological needs. The practical problem of disposal eventually intruded on his fantasy, but Dennis approached it with the same methodical precision he brought to his day job. He couldn't risk discovery, which meant the body had to disappear completely. The garden behind his flat provided the solution, a private space where he could work undisturbed under the cover of darkness. Over the following days, Dennis systematically dismembered Stephen Holmes's body, using kitchen knives and a saw to reduce the corpse to manageable pieces. The process was messy, time-consuming, and physically demanding, but Dennis approached it with the clinical detachment of a butcher preparing meat for market. He burned the larger pieces in the garden, creating bonfires that sent plumes of greasy smoke into the London sky. The smaller fragments, bones, teeth, and other identifiable remains, required more creative disposal methods. Some were buried in the garden, others were flushed down the toilet or thrown into nearby rivers. Dennis took meticulous care to ensure that nothing remained that could be traced back to Stephen Holmes or to him. The young man simply vanished from the world as if he had never existed at all. But the psychological impact of his first kill lingered long after the physical evidence had been destroyed. Dennis discovered that murder was addictive, providing a rush of power and control that no other experience could match. The act of taking a life had transformed him from victim to victor, from the abandoned to the one who ensured others could never abandon him. The weeks following Stephen's murder were marked by a strange calm in Dennis's routine. He returned to work as if nothing had happened, processed unemployment claims with his usual efficiency, and maintained the facade of the helpful civil servant. But beneath the surface, he was planning his next kill, replaying the experience over and over in his mind, and refining his technique for future victims. The success of his disposal method gave Dennis confidence that he could kill again without detection. The garden provided the perfect crematorium, and his neighbors had shown no curiosity about the occasional bonfires or unusual smells. London's urban environment offered both camouflage and opportunity. Millions of people lived anonymous lives in the city, and one more missing person would barely register with the overworked police. His second victim came just weeks later, another young man whose name has been lost to history. The pattern was identical. A chance meeting in a pub, an invitation back to Melrose Avenue, and the same brutal combination of strangulation and drowning. But this time, Dennis was more efficient, more confident, and more coldly calculating in his approach. The third kill followed within months, then the fourth, each murder building on the lessons learned from the previous one. Dennis developed a routine that minimized risk while maximizing his psychological satisfaction. He became adept at selecting victims who wouldn't be missed. Runaways, drifters, young men estranged from their families, and immigrants with few social connections. His method evolved as well, becoming more refined and reliable with each kill. Once inside his home, usually at 195 Melrose Avenue or later at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, Nilsson would intoxicate the men and strangle them, often using a ligature. The alcohol served multiple purposes. It made the victims more compliant, less likely to fight back effectively, and easier to overpower when the moment came. By the end of 1979, Dennis had killed at least 3 young men, though the exact number remains unclear due to his tendency to lie about details and his poor record-keeping. What was certain was that he had fully embraced his role as a predator, viewing potential victims not as human beings with their own hopes and dreams, but as objects to be collected and possessed. The psychological transformation was complete. The lonely civil servant who had once desperately sought human connection had become a monster who took it by force, creating relationships with the dead that were more satisfying to him than any he had experienced with the living. The descent into madness wasn't a sudden plunge. It was a gradual slide that accelerated with each successful kill, each undiscovered crime, each confirmation that he could murder with impunity. Dennis Nilsson had found his calling, and London would pay a terrible price for his discovery of it. The years between 1979 and 1981 marked the peak of Dennis Nilsson's killing spree, a period when the monster within him reached full maturation and claimed victim after victim with terrifying efficiency. The initial awkwardness of his first murder had given way to a chilling professionalism that turned mass murder into a routine as mundane as his daily commute to the unemployment office. Kenneth Ockenden became Dennis's most significant victim, not because his death was more brutal than the others, but because it represented the killer's complete psychological evolution into a creature devoid of human empathy. He would go on to kill 23-year-old Kevin Ockenden, a Canadian tourist who had made the fatal mistake of accepting Dennis's offer of hospitality during what should have been the adventure of a lifetime. Ockenden was different from Dennis's usual victims. He wasn't a desperate runaway or a homeless drifter. He was an educated, middle-class young man with a loving family back in Canada and a bright future ahead of him. His disappearance would be noticed, investigated, and mourned, factors that should have deterred a rational killer but only seemed to excite Dennis further. The murder followed Dennis's established pattern with surgical precision. He met Ockenden in a central London pub, struck up a conversation about travel and life experiences, and gradually maneuvered the conversation toward an invitation back to Melrose Avenue. Ockenden, perhaps homesick and eager for companionship, accepted readily, unaware that he was following a predator back to his lair. The killing took place after hours of what Ockenden must have considered pleasant conversation and social drinking. Nilsson would often meet his victims in a bar in North or Central London, luring them back to his property where he would kill them by strangulation and sometimes drowning. When the moment came, Dennis struck with the cold efficiency of an experienced executioner, using a ligature to cut off the young Canadian's air supply until his struggles ceased and his body went limp. But it was Dennis's behavior after the murder that truly revealed the depths of his depravity. Following the killings, Nilsson would bathe and dress the victim, keeping the body for an extended period of time, treating the corpses as if they were still alive and capable of providing the companionship he craved. For nearly 2 weeks, Dennis lived with Ockenden's decomposing body, conducting lengthy conversations with the corpse, watching television together, and even taking the body to bed with him at night. The necrophilic aspects of his crimes weren't motivated by sexual deviance alone. They represented a complete break from reality, a fantasy world where death was merely an inconvenient detail that didn't interfere with the relationships he had always been incapable of maintaining with the living. When the smell of decomposition became overwhelming and the physical reality of death could no longer be ignored, Dennis began the grisly process of disposal. He had refined his technique considerably since his first kill, developing an efficient system for reducing human beings to ash and bone fragments. The dismemberment was carried out in his bathtub, where the blood and other fluids could be easily washed away. He used kitchen knives, a hacksaw, and his bare hands to reduce Ockenden's body to manageable pieces. The garden bonfires became a regular occurrence that neighbors learned to ignore. Dennis timed them carefully, usually lighting them late at night or early in the morning when visibility was poor and curiosity minimal. He mixed the human remains with household garbage and paper to disguise the nature of what he was burning, creating acrid plumes of smoke that carried the stench of burning flesh across North London. 16-year-old Martin Duffy was among the victims who followed Ockenden into Dennis's web of death. Duffy was barely more than a child, a runaway who had fled an abusive home situation only to encounter something far worse on London's streets. His youth and vulnerability made him the perfect target for Dennis's predatory instincts. The teenager's murder was particularly brutal, even by Dennis's standards. Perhaps it was Duffy's desperate attempts to escape, or maybe Dennis was simply becoming more sadistic as his kill count mounted. Whatever the reason, the boy's death was prolonged and agonizing, involving multiple methods of torture before the final ligature ended his suffering. William David Sutherland, 26, alongside 4 unidentified victims, represented the peak of Dennis's killing efficiency. By this point, he had streamlined every aspect of his operation from victim selection to body disposal. He could identify potential targets with a glance, manipulate them with practiced charm, and kill them with mechanical precision. Sutherland was a particularly tragic case. A young man struggling with alcoholism who had been trying to turn his life around when he encountered Dennis. His vulnerability made him an easy mark, but his disappearance devastated a family that had been desperately trying to help him overcome his demons. For Dennis, Sutherland was simply another body to add to his collection. The unidentified victims represent perhaps the most horrific aspect of Dennis's crimes. These were human beings whose names, histories, and connections to the world have been forever lost. They exist now only as statistical entries in police files, their individuality erased by a killer who saw them as interchangeable objects rather than unique people with their own stories. Dennis's ability to make people disappear completely was perhaps his most chilling talent. He understood instinctively how to select victims who wouldn't be missed, or if they were missed, wouldn't be searched for very hard. London in the late 1970s and early 1980s was full of such people: immigrants, runaways, the mentally ill, and the socially isolated. The killer's routine had become so refined that he could commit murder with assembly line efficiency. A typical night would begin with several hours of hunting in the gay bars and pubs of central London, where Dennis would observe potential victims with the cold calculation of a predator evaluating prey. He looked for specific characteristics: youth, vulnerability, social isolation, and that particular brand of desperation that made people willing to trust strangers. The selection process was crucial to his success. Dennis never chose victims impulsively. He studied them carefully, engaging them in conversation to assess their backgrounds and determine whether their disappearance would trigger a serious police investigation. He developed an almost supernatural ability to identify people who existed on society's margins, individuals whose absence might be noted but wouldn't necessarily result in extensive searches. Once a victim was selected and lured back to Melrose Avenue, the endgame unfolded with horrifying predictability. Dennis would spend hours building trust, creating an atmosphere of safety and companionship that made his eventual attack even more shocking and traumatic for his victims. The psychological torture of that betrayal may have been as devastating as the physical violence that followed. The murders themselves became increasingly swift and efficient. In some cases, he drowned them in a bathtub or sink, but strangulation remained his preferred method due to its intimacy and the control it afforded him over the timing of death. Dennis wanted to watch his victims die, to see the exact moment when life left their eyes and they became his perfect, permanent companions. The disposal process had evolved into a grotesque ritual that Dennis performed with the dedication of a craftsman perfecting his trade. Nilsson's final victim was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow, whose murder at Melrose Avenue marked the end of an era and the beginning of an even more dangerous phase in the killer's evolution. By 1981, Dennis had murdered at least 9 young men at 195 Melrose Avenue, transforming a quiet residential street into the epicenter of one of Britain's most prolific serial killing campaigns. The flat itself had become a charnel house, its walls soaked with the blood of innocents, its garden fertilized with human ash, and its very foundations corrupted by unspeakable evil. But Dennis's reign of terror at Melrose Avenue was coming to an end, not because of any police investigation or growing suspicion from neighbors, but because of practical considerations that would force him to relocate his operation. The need for a new killing ground would ultimately prove to be his undoing, setting in motion the chain of events that would finally bring his horrific crimes to light. The monster had perfected his craft, but perfection, as Dennis would soon discover, could be its own form of trap. The move from 195 Melrose Avenue to 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill should have represented a fresh start for Dennis Nilsson, an opportunity to leave behind the blood-soaked memories of his previous killing ground. Instead, it marked the beginning of his final chapter as a free man and the stage where his carefully constructed facade would finally crumble, exposing the monster within for all the world to see. The new flat presented significant challenges that Dennis had failed to fully consider in his eagerness to relocate. Unlike the ground floor property at Melrose Avenue with its private garden and easy disposal options, the Muswell Hill address was an upstairs flat with no direct outdoor access. The garden bonfires that had served him so well for nearly 4 years were no longer an option, forcing him to devise new methods of body disposal that would ultimately lead to his capture. But Dennis was too addicted to killing to let practical considerations deter him from continuing his murderous campaign. The psychological needs that drove him to commit murder had only intensified during his years of successful killing, and the prospect of living without the perfect companions that only death could provide was unthinkable. His first victim at Cranley Gardens was John Howlett, a young man whose trusting nature and desperate circumstances made him the perfect target for Dennis's practiced manipulation. These victims were identified as John Howlett, Archibald Graham Allen, and Stephen Sinclair, representing the final chapter in Dennis's killing spree and the beginning of the evidence trail that would eventually convict him. Howlett's murder followed the same pattern that Dennis had perfected over dozens of previous kills, but the disposal presented unprecedented challenges. These victims presented Nilsson with much greater disposal challenges, given the apartment's lack of direct access outdoor space. He overcame these obstacles by boiling the heads, feet, and hands, and dissecting the bodies into smaller pieces that could be flushed down the flat's plumbing system. The new disposal method was both more labor-intensive and more dangerous than his previous techniques. Dennis spent hours in his kitchen, boiling human remains like some grotesque parody of a chef preparing dinner. The smell was overwhelming, a nauseating mixture of cooking flesh and chemical cleaners that permeated the entire building. Yet somehow, the other tenants either failed to notice the odor or chose to ignore it, allowing Dennis to continue his horrific work undisturbed. Nilsson attempted to dispose of the flesh, internal organs, and smaller bones of all 3 victims killed at Cranley Gardens by flushing their dissected remains down his toilet. The method required him to reduce human bodies to pieces small enough to navigate the building's aging plumbing system, a process that took days of careful preparation and systematic dismemberment. Archibald Graham Allen became Dennis's second victim at Cranley Gardens, a young man whose life was cut short just as he was beginning to find his place in the world. Allen's murder demonstrated that Dennis had learned nothing from the disposal challenges presented by his first Muswell Hill kill. If anything, he had become more reckless, more confident in his ability to evade detection regardless of the evidence he was literally flushing into London's sewage system. The psychological pressure of living in closer proximity to other tenants should have deterred Dennis from continuing his killing spree, but instead it seemed to excite him. The danger of discovery added an element of thrill to his crimes that the isolated Melrose Avenue flat had never provided. He was playing a deadly game with increasingly high stakes, and the adrenaline rush was intoxicating. Stephen Sinclair would prove to be Dennis's final victim, though neither killer nor victim could have known it at the time of their fatal encounter. On February 11, 1983, Nilsson was charged with the murder of 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair, his final victim. The young man's death represented the culmination of Dennis's 5-year killing spree and the crime that would finally bring his reign of terror to an end. Sinclair's murder was particularly tragic because it was so utterly preventable. By early 1983, Dennis's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and there were warning signs that should have alerted authorities to the danger he represented. Nilsson was questioned, but officers took no action. Had they done a proper investigation and caught Nilsson, 15 victims might still be alive. The failure of law enforcement to recognize the threat Dennis posed was a systemic breakdown that allowed him to continue killing for months longer than should have been possible. Multiple potential victims had escaped his clutches and reported their experiences to police, but the complaints were dismissed or inadequately investigated, leaving Dennis free to claim more lives. Another survivor was Douglas Stewart, who fought off a strangulation attempt by Nilsson in November 1980. But police dismissed the incident as a domestic dispute rather than an attempted murder. The missed opportunities to stop Dennis's killing spree represent one of the most tragic aspects of the entire case. Lives that could have been saved if the warning signs had been taken seriously. But by February 1983, Dennis's luck was finally running out. The disposal method that had allowed him to kill 3 men at Cranley Gardens was creating problems that even his twisted ingenuity couldn't solve. On February 4, 1983, Nilsson wrote a letter to estate agents complaining that the drains at Cranley Gardens were blocked and that the situation for both himself and the other tenants at the property was intolerable. The irony of Dennis complaining about a problem that he himself had created was lost on no one who later learned the full story. The blocked drains were clogged with human remains that he had been systematically flushing away for months, and the intolerable situation was entirely of his own making. But his complaint to the estate agents set in motion the chain of events that would finally expose his crimes. When drain workers arrived on February 8, 1983, to investigate the blockage, they made a discovery that would shock London to its core. The manhole cover on Cranley Gardens concealed a horror that defied imagination: chunks of human flesh, fragments of bone, and other organic matter that could only have come from dismembered corpses. The stench that rose from the open drain was so overwhelming that several workers became physically ill. The police were called immediately, and the investigation that followed moved with unprecedented speed and thoroughness. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. led the inquiry with the kind of methodical precision that Dennis's crimes demanded, following the trail of evidence back through the building's plumbing system to its source. When officers knocked on the door of Dennis's flat, they found a man who seemed remarkably calm given the circumstances. His demeanor was cooperative, almost helpful, as if he were just another concerned tenant rather than the perpetrator of one of Britain's most horrific crime sprees. But the flat itself told a different story. The smell of death clung to every surface, and careful examination revealed traces of blood, bone fragments, and other evidence of systematic murder. Dennis's initial denials quickly crumbled under the weight of physical evidence. Nilsson confessed to Detective Chief Inspector Peter J., but even his confession was tainted by the psychological manipulation that had characterized his entire adult life. He presented himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a cold-blooded killer, claiming that his crimes were acts of love rather than murder. During his trial at the Old Bailey, it was revealed 3 bodies were found at his Muswell Hill address, and bones from 8 victims had been uncovered at his previous residence. The forensic evidence painted a picture of systematic killing that spanned nearly 5 years and claimed at least a dozen lives, though the true number of victims may never be known. The trial itself became a media sensation, with reporters and spectators packing the courtroom to catch a glimpse of the mild-mannered civil servant who had terrorized London for half a decade. Dennis seemed to relish the attention, using his time in the witness box to present his warped philosophy of love and death to a horrified but fascinated public. His defense team attempted to argue that he was insane, that no rational person could have committed such horrific crimes. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Dennis's murders were carefully planned, methodically executed, and efficiently concealed. He had held down a demanding job, maintained normal relationships with colleagues and neighbors, and successfully hidden his crimes for years. This wasn't the behavior of a madman, but of a calculating predator who understood exactly what he was doing. The jury rejected the insanity defense, finding Dennis guilty on all charges. Convicted at the Old Bailey of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder, Nilsson was sentenced to life imprisonment, bringing an end to one. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Monster of Lahore, the Javed Iqbal story. Deep within Pakistan's bustling metropolis of Lahore, where ancient mosques cast long shadows over crowded bazaars, a predator walked among the innocent. For 6 merciless years, children vanished from the narrow alleyways and forgotten corners of the city. Swallowed whole by darkness, their voices silenced forever. What emerged from the investigation would shake the very foundations of human decency and etch a name into the annals of horror: Javed Iqbal. This is not merely a tale of murder. It is the chronicle of a monster who confessed to slaughtering 100 innocent children, each death more brutal than the last. A beast who dissolved his victims in acid, who kept trophies of their suffering, and who taunted police with photographs of their final moments. Welcome to the most chilling case in Pakistani criminal history, a descent into pure evil that will haunt your dreams and challenge everything you thought you knew about the depths of human depravity. The sweltering heat of Lahore's summer pressed down like a suffocating blanket on December 2nd, 1999, when police officers first stepped across the threshold of house number 16B, Ravi Road. What they discovered would forever scar their memories and send shockwaves through the very soul of Pakistan. The stench hit them first, a nauseating cocktail of decay and chemicals that burned their nostrils and forced seasoned investigators to retreat, gasping for clean air. But duty called them back into that chamber of horrors, where the walls themselves seemed to whisper of unspeakable crimes. Scattered across the floor like discarded toys lay children's shoes. Tiny sandals, worn sneakers, and school shoes that would never again carry their owners home. Each pair told a story of a life cut short, of dreams murdered in their infancy. The investigating officers counted them with trembling hands. 42 pairs in total, representing 42 young souls who had entered this house of death and never emerged. But the shoes were merely the beginning of the nightmare that awaited them. Inspector Hassan Ali Malik, a veteran of 20 years on the force, would later describe the scene as walking through hell itself. His voice cracked as he recounted finding plastic bags filled with remains, photographs of children in various states of terror, and most chilling of all, detailed journals documenting each murder with the clinical precision of a scientist studying insects. The killer had kept meticulous records: names, ages, dates of death, and horrifyingly detailed descriptions of how each child had met their end. Muhammad Bilal, age 8, strangled with a rope on March 15, 1993. Ali Hassan, age 10, poisoned and dismembered on August 22nd, 1994. The list went on and on, a catalog of innocents destroyed by absolute evil. Among the evidence, investigators discovered a letter that would chill them to their very bones. Written in Urdu with careful penmanship, it began, "I have killed 100 children. I could have killed 500, but time did not permit. I am Javed Iqbal, killer of 100 children, and I hate this world because of injustices." This was no ordinary confession. This was a manifesto written by a man who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner of the most vulnerable members of society. He detailed his methodology with pride, describing how he would lure street children, orphans, runaways, and the forgotten, into his lair with promises of food, work, or shelter. The investigation team, led by Deputy Superintendent Zulfikar Ahmed, began piecing together the horrific puzzle. They discovered that Javed Iqbal had operated like a spider in his web, targeting children who wouldn't be immediately missed. Street vendors, shoe-shine boys, beggars, the invisible children of Lahore's sprawling urban landscape. His method was as calculated as it was cruel. He would gain the children's trust over days or weeks, sometimes providing them with food and temporary shelter. Then, when they least expected it, he would strike. Some were strangled with chains in the basement of his house. Others were drugged into unconsciousness before meeting their fate. The most horrifying discovery was a large metal drum, stained with acid burns, where investigators believed the monster had dissolved his victims' bodies. The basement of 16B Ravi Road revealed chambers that defied human comprehension. Rooms with chains bolted to the walls, makeshift beds where children had spent their final terrified hours, and chemical equipment used for body disposal. The concrete floors bore permanent stains that no amount of cleaning could ever remove, silent witnesses to years of systematic slaughter. Dr. Rubina Shaheen, the forensic pathologist assigned to the case, struggled to maintain her professional composure as she examined the evidence. "I have worked with murder cases for 15 years, she later testified, but nothing could have prepared me for the calculated brutality displayed in this case. This was not the work of someone who had lost control. This was methodical, planned, and executed with terrifying precision." The neighborhood around Ravi Road buzzed with whispers and theories. Residents recalled seeing children entering the house but never leaving. Some remembered hearing strange sounds at night, muffled screams that they had dismissed as cats fighting or the wind playing tricks. Mrs. Fatima Begum, who lived 3 houses down, broke down in tears as she told investigators, "Sometimes I heard children crying, but I thought he was just disciplining his nephews. Oh Allah, forgive me for not investigating further." As news of the discovery spread through Lahore, panic gripped the city. Parents clutched their children closer, and the streets that had once teemed with young vendors and workers fell eerily quiet after sunset. The realization that a monster had been hunting among them for 6 years sent shockwaves through every neighborhood, every household. But where was Javed Iqbal himself? The killer had vanished into the night like smoke, leaving behind only his gruesome legacy and taunting confessions. Police launched the largest manhunt in Pakistani history, with officers scouring every corner of the country. His photograph was plastered on every newspaper front page, his description broadcast on every television and radio station. Meanwhile, investigators continued their grim work at the House of Horrors. They discovered a workshop where Iqbal had apparently dismembered his victims, complete with saws, knives, and surgical instruments. Blood stains mapped a geography of terror across multiple rooms, each telling the story of a life extinguished in agony. The killer's journals revealed a mind consumed by hatred and justified by delusion. He wrote extensively about his motives, claiming that society had wronged him and that his victims were merely instruments of his revenge against the world. "These children are better off dead than living on the streets like animals," he had written in one particularly chilling entry. "I am doing them a favor by ending their misery." Child psychologist Dr. Amjad Hussain was brought in to analyze the killer's writings and methodology. His assessment painted the portrait of a man who had completely divorced himself from human empathy. Javed Iqbal didn't see his victims as human beings, Dr. Hussain explained. To him, they were objects to be used for his own gratification and disposal. This level of dehumanization is extremely rare and represents one of the most severe forms of psychopathy we've encountered. As the investigation deepened, more horrors came to light. Neighbors reported that trucks had regularly visited the house late at night, presumably to dispose of remains. Others recalled the constant smell of chemicals emanating from the property. The killer had operated his factory of death under their very noses, protected by their collective desire to mind their own business. The media frenzy surrounding the case reached unprecedented levels. International news outlets began picking up the story, painting Pakistan in a horrific light and adding pressure on law enforcement to bring the monster to justice. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif personally ordered that no resources be spared in capturing Javed Iqbal. But as December 1999 drew to a close, the killer remained a phantom, leaving behind a city traumatized and a nation demanding answers. Parents checked and rechecked their children's whereabouts, schools implemented new security measures, and the streets of Lahore felt the heavy weight of collective guilt and fear. The investigation had uncovered the crime, identified the perpetrator, and revealed the scope of his evil. But the monster himself remained free, somewhere in the darkness, perhaps already planning his next move. The nightmare was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. As 1999 turned to 2000, one question haunted every mind in Pakistan. Where is Javed Iqbal, and when will he strike again? The first light of January 2000 brought no relief to the terror-stricken city of Lahore. If anything, the new millennium had ushered in a darker chapter as investigators delved deeper into the abyss of Javed Iqbal's crimes, uncovering layers of horror that seemed to multiply with each passing day. Detective Inspector Malik sat hunched over the killer's journals, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights spent deciphering the madman's meticulous records. Each page revealed new depths of depravity, chronicling murders that defied human comprehension. The killer had categorized his victims by age, method of death, and what he called behavioral patterns, a clinical approach that made the crimes even more chilling. Subject number 47, Tariq Ahmed, age 9, acquired from Data Darbar Shrine area. Resistant subject, required additional restraint methods. Disposal completed using standard acid procedure. Time of death, 3:47 a.m., November 15th, 1997. The entries continued in this horrifyingly matter-of-fact tone, each one documenting the extinction of a young life with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for a grocery list. The forensic team, led by Dr. Shaheen, had made breakthrough discoveries in their analysis of the acid-stained drum found in Iqbal's basement. Chemical analysis revealed traces of hydrochloric acid mixed with human remains, DNA fragments that told the story of children who had been completely dissolved, leaving no trace for their families to bury or mourn. He perfected his disposal method over time, Dr. Shaheen explained to the investigation team, her voice steady despite the horror of her findings. Early victims were buried or dumped, but later ones were completely dissolved. He was learning, adapting, becoming more efficient at erasing evidence of his crimes. The killer's evolution was documented in his own words. In journal entries from 1993, he expressed frustration with disposal methods. Burial is too risky. Neighbors ask too many questions about digging. By 1996, his entries showed satisfaction with chemical dissolution. Complete elimination achieved. No trace remains. Method perfected. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a collection of Polaroid photographs hidden in a false wall. Images that would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. The pictures showed children in various states of captivity and terror, some clearly taken moments before their deaths. Their eyes spoke of incomprehensible fear, of innocence confronted with absolute evil. Among these photographs, investigators found images of the killer himself, posing with his victims like a hunter displaying trophies. Javed Iqbal appeared as a thin, unremarkable man with calculating eyes and a beard that gave him an air of false respectability. In one particularly chilling image, he stood beside a chained child, his expression showing not rage or madness, but cold satisfaction. The investigation team worked around the clock to identify victims from the photographs. They released carefully censored images to the public, hoping desperate parents might recognize their missing children. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of families came forward, each hoping for closure while dreading confirmation of their worst fears. Mrs. Rashida Bibi arrived at the police station clutching a worn photograph of her son Hassan, who had disappeared 2 years earlier while selling newspapers outside Lahore railway station. When shown an evidence photograph, her knees buckled and her scream echoed through the station. Her 8-year-old boy had become victim number 73 in Javed Iqbal's catalog of horror. He was just trying to earn money for school books, she sobbed, her words barely intelligible through her grief. He would bring home 10 rupees every day, so proud that he could help the family. And that monster destroyed my baby. As more victims were identified, a clearer picture emerged of Javed Iqbal's hunting patterns. He targeted the most vulnerable, children from the poorest families, street orphans with no one to search for them, and runaways escaping abusive homes. His victims ranged in age from 6 to 16, but most were between 8 and 12 years old. The killer's journals revealed his predatory methodology in nauseating detail. He would spend days or weeks grooming potential victims, sometimes providing them with food and temporary shelter to gain their trust. He operated from multiple locations across Lahore, moving his base of operations whenever he sensed suspicion. "I am like a father to these street rats," he had written in one entry. "I give them warmth, food, and purpose. In return, they give me satisfaction." The twisted logic of his rationalization showed a mind completely divorced from human morality. Dr. Amjad Hussain, the consulting psychologist, painted a psychological profile that sent chills through the investigation team. Javed Iqbal exhibits characteristics of extreme narcissistic personality disorder combined with psychopathic tendencies, he explained. He genuinely believes he was providing a service to society by killing these children. In his mind, he was cleaning up the streets. The killer's background slowly emerged through intensive investigation. Born in 1956 in Lahore, Javed Iqbal came from a middle-class family. His father was a businessman who dealt in iron and steel, providing the family with modest prosperity. Neighbors from his childhood described him as a quiet, intelligent boy who showed early signs of antisocial behavior. Even as a child, Javed was different, recalled his elementary school teacher, Mrs. Saira Khan. He was brilliant academically but had no friends. I caught him once torturing a cat behind the school building. When I confronted him, he showed no remorse, just cold curiosity about my reaction. His descent into evil appeared to accelerate in his 20s. Former business associates described him as manipulative and prone to explosive anger when crossed. He had been involved in several failed business ventures and had spent time in jail for fraud-related charges in the 1980s. "Prison changed him," said Mahmoud Ahmed, who had shared a cell with Iqbal for 6 months. "He came in angry at the world, but when he was released, he was something else entirely. Cold, calculating. He talked about getting revenge on society for ruining his life." The investigation revealed that Iqbal had been planning his killing spree for years. He had carefully studied missing persons reports, law enforcement procedures, and disposal methods. His journals contained detailed notes about police response times in different neighborhoods and observations about which types of children disappearances received the most attention. "He was a student of murder," Detective Inspector Malik observed grimly. "Every aspect of his operation was planned and refined over time. He knew exactly how long he could keep children before killing them, how to avoid detection, and how to choose victims who wouldn't be immediately missed." The killer's house on Ravi Road had been purchased specifically for his crimes. Real estate records showed he had bought the property in 1992, just 1 year before his first confirmed murder. He had spent months preparing the basement, installing soundproofing, chains, and drainage systems designed for easy cleanup. Neighbors recalled seeing him frequently carrying large bags and chemical containers into the house during nighttime hours. "We thought he was running some kind of laboratory or workshop," explained Mr. Abdul Wahab, who lived next door. "The smell was terrible, but when we complained, he said he was doing scientific experiments for a university research project." As the investigation team processed the overwhelming evidence, they began to understand the true scope of Javed Iqbal's evil. This wasn't a man who had snapped under pressure or lost control. This was a methodical predator who had turned child murder into an art form. The killer had kept detailed records not just of his murders, but of his victims' final moments. He documented their pleas for mercy, their promises to be good if he would let them go home, their tears and terror. These accounts, written in his neat handwriting, revealed a mind that fed on suffering with the hunger of a vampire. Subject number 62 begged for his mother, read one entry. Tears and promises of good behavior, standard emotional responses, proceeded with termination at 2:15 a.m. Subject expired after 4 minutes of applied pressure to throat. Satisfactory results. The clinical tone of these murder logs demonstrated a level of emotional detachment that horrified even experienced investigators. Javed Iqbal didn't just kill children. He studied their deaths, cataloged their suffering, and preserved their terror as keepsakes. As January 2000 progressed, the manhunt for Pakistan's most wanted criminal intensified. But even as law enforcement agencies across the country searched for him, Javed Iqbal remained a ghost, leaving behind only his legacy of horror and the traumatized city that would never be the same. The monster had been unveiled, his crimes exposed, and his methods dissected, but justice remained elusive. Somewhere in Pakistan's vast landscape, the killer of 100 children continued to evade capture, perhaps even now selecting his next victim. March 2000 brought no respite from the nightmare that had consumed Pakistan. As investigators continued excavating the depths of Javed Iqbal's depravity, new horrors emerged that defied comprehension. The killer had not merely murdered children. He had transformed himself into a systematic destroyer of innocence, a machine calibrated for maximum suffering. The breakthrough came when forensic experts discovered a hidden room behind a false wall in the basement of 16B Ravi Road. This chamber, barely 6 feet square, had served as Javed Iqbal's photography studio of death. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs showing children in various stages of captivity, torture, and murder. Dr. Rashid Malik, the senior forensic photographer assigned to document the evidence, required psychiatric counseling after cataloging the images. "I have photographed crime scenes for 22 years," he whispered to investigators, his hands trembling as he handled each picture. "But this is not the work of a human being. This is something else entirely." The photographs revealed the true extent of Iqbal's systematic approach to murder. He had documented everything, from the initial capture of his victims to their final moments of life. Each child's journey through hell had been meticulously preserved, creating a visual encyclopedia of human suffering. The killer's journals provided nauseating commentary to accompany the photographs. Photography serves dual purposes, he had written in one entry: documentation for personal records and leverage for victim compliance. Subject cooperation increases significantly when shown images of predecessor fates. This revelation hit the investigation team like a physical blow. Javed Iqbal had shown captive children photographs of previous victims' deaths to ensure compliance. The psychological torture had been as methodical as the physical murder, designed to break their spirits completely before ending their lives. Detective Inspector Malik discovered that the killer had organized his victims into categories: cooperative subjects, resistant subjects, and special projects, each group subjected to different treatment protocols. The cooperative ones were killed quickly, often through strangulation or poisoning. The resistant ones endured prolonged torture. The special projects suffered fates too horrific to describe in detail. Among the recovered evidence, investigators found detailed floor plans of the house showing different chambers serving specific purposes. The selection room, where victims were initially processed. The conditioning chambers, where they were held and psychologically broken. The termination room, where final acts were carried out. And finally, the disposal area, where bodies were dissolved in acid or dismembered for easier transport. The killer had even installed a primitive ventilation system to manage the smell of decomposition and chemicals. Neighbors' complaints about odors had been genuine concerns, but Iqbal's engineering had prevented the smells from becoming overwhelming enough to trigger serious investigation. Mrs. Khadija Perveen, whose 9-year-old son Asif had disappeared in 1998, was among the parents who courageously agreed to help identify victims from the photographs. The moment she saw her child's face in one of the images, she collapsed, her screams echoing through the police station. "My baby," she wailed. "My innocent baby. What did that demon do to you?" The photograph showed young Asif chained to a wall, his eyes wide with terror, pleading silently with the camera. According to Iqbal's records, the boy had survived in captivity for 6 days before being strangled with a chain. During those 6 days, he had been photographed repeatedly, his deteriorating condition documented with clinical precision. Day 1. Subject shows standard fear responses: crying, begging, promises of good behavior. Day 3. Subject has accepted situation, no longer resisting. Day 5. Subject appears broken, no longer responds to stimuli. Day 6. Termination completed. Subject offered no resistance. These journal entries revealed a monster who studied human psychology with the focus of a scientist. He had learned to break children's spirits systematically, measuring their psychological deterioration like a researcher tracking the progress of an experiment. The investigation team discovered that Iqbal had refined his methods over the years, developing increasingly efficient protocols for capture, processing, and disposal. His early victims had been killed impulsively, but later murders showed careful planning and execution that minimized risk while maximizing his satisfaction. "He evolved into the perfect predator," observed Dr. Hussein, the consulting psychologist. "Every mistake taught him something new. Every successful kill improved his methodology. He was learning from experience, becoming more dangerous with each murder." The killer's journals documented his learning process in chilling detail. After victim number 15 escaped and nearly exposed his operation, he implemented new security measures. Following a close call with police in 1995, he developed new victim selection criteria that focused entirely on children with no family connections or support systems. "Street children are invisible," he had written after this incident. "Society ignores them in life and does not search for them in death. Perfect subjects for my work." This calculated approach to victim selection revealed the true depth of Javed Iqbal's evil. He wasn't killing in fits of rage or uncontrolled compulsion. He was running a systematic operation designed to satisfy his urges while minimizing legal consequences. The forensic team made another horrifying discovery when they analyzed the acid dissolution equipment in detail. Chemical residue analysis revealed that the killer had dissolved at least 60 complete bodies, leaving no trace for families to bury or mourn. He had literally erased these children from existence, denying their loved ones even the closure of a grave to visit. "The acid bath was his masterpiece," explained Dr. Shaheen grimly. "Complete molecular breakdown of organic matter. No DNA, no dental records, no fingerprints. These children simply ceased to exist in any physical form." The killer had documented his acid disposal process with the same clinical precision he applied to everything else. Temperature requirements, acid concentration ratios, timing for complete dissolution, all recorded in neat handwriting that made the information seem like legitimate scientific research rather than instructions for body disposal. Among the most disturbing evidence were cassette tapes found hidden in various locations throughout the house. These recordings captured the final moments of several victims, their pleas, their prayers, their calls for their mothers. Javed Iqbal had preserved these sounds like a collector preserving rare music, playing them back for his own entertainment. The investigation team could only listen to fragments of these recordings before requiring psychological support. The sounds of children begging for their lives, promising to be good if only they could go home, calling out for mothers who would never hold them again. These audio fragments painted a portrait of suffering that no human should be capable of inflicting. "Please, sir, I'll be a good boy," came the voice of one victim from the static-filled tape. "I won't tell anyone. I just want to see my mama. Please don't hurt me anymore." The recording continued for several more minutes before ending abruptly in silence. The killer had also recorded himself during some of the murders, creating audio documentation of his own responses to his victim's suffering. These recordings revealed a man who fed on terror like others might feed on food, drawing strength and satisfaction from every sob, every plea, every expression of hopelessness. Pakistani law enforcement had never encountered anything approaching this level of systematic evil. The case required consultation with international experts on serial killing, child abduction, and psychopathic behavior. Even seasoned FBI profilers who reviewed the case files expressed shock at the methodical nature of Iqbal's crimes. Most serial killers show some level of disorganization or emotional involvement, explained Dr. Robert Hayes, an American criminal psychologist who consulted on the case. Javed Iqbal represents something far more dangerous: a completely organized, emotionally detached killing machine who treated murder as a business operation. As spring 2000 arrived, the investigation had uncovered the full scope of Javed Iqbal's killing machine. 100 children had been fed into his system of systematic murder, each one processed with industrial efficiency and clinical detachment. The monster had created an assembly line of death, perfecting his methods over 7 years of uninterrupted operation. But the killing machine's creator remained at large, somewhere in Pakistan or perhaps beyond its borders. The manhunt continued with increased urgency as investigators realized they weren't just hunting a serial killer. They were pursuing a man who had elevated child murder to an art form and might already be establishing new operations elsewhere. The machine had been exposed, its methods revealed, and its victims honored. But its creator continued to evade justice, leaving behind a nation traumatized and a world horrified by the depths of human evil. October 2000 marked a year since the discovery of Javed Iqbal's House of Horrors, and Pakistan's most wanted man remained a phantom haunting the collective nightmare of a nation. But the walls of secrecy and terror he had built around himself were beginning to crumble, and the final chapter of his reign of evil was about to unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On October 18, 2000, the Pakistani newspaper Jang received a package with no return address. Inside, editor Muhammad Hassan found a letter written in the same meticulous handwriting that had terrorized investigators for months. Javed Iqbal was breaking his silence. "I am sending you this letter to clear my name." The correspondence began with typical narcissistic audacity. "The police have exaggerated my crimes. I have killed only 100 children, not the 120 they claim. I am a man of precision, and accuracy in reporting is important to me." Even in surrender, the monster insisted on controlling his narrative. But this letter would prove to be his fatal mistake. Postal investigators traced the package to Lahore, confirming that the killer had never left the city. He had been hiding in plain sight while the entire country searched for him. The letter continued with chilling details about his motives and methodology. "These children were suffering on the streets like animals," he wrote. "I gave them shelter, food, and purpose before ending their misery. I am not a monster. I am a savior who saved them from lives of degradation and poverty." This twisted logic revealed a mind that had completely rewritten reality to justify unspeakable evil. In Javed Iqbal's deluded worldview, mass murder had become an act of mercy, systematic torture a form of kindness, and the dissolution of children's bodies in acid a method of liberation. Detective Inspector Malik formed a special task force to analyze every aspect of the letter. Forensic specialists examined the paper, ink, and postal markings while behavioral analysts studied the content for psychological clues. The killer's need for recognition and control had finally provided the opening they needed. "He can't help himself," observed Dr. Hussein during a task force briefing. "Narcissistic personalities require admiration and attention. His ego won't allow him to remain silent while others tell his story. This compulsion will be his downfall." The letter also contained specific details about murders that had never been made public, confirming its authenticity and providing new leads for investigators. Iqbal described the final moments of several victims with nauseating precision, seemingly unaware that his words were providing law enforcement with additional evidence for his eventual trial. 3 weeks after the letter's publication, another package arrived at Jang newspaper. This one contained photographs, new images that hadn't been found at the Ravi Roadhouse. The killer was still documenting his crimes, still feeding his compulsion to preserve his victims' suffering for his own gratification. But these photographs contained a crucial mistake. In the background of one image, investigators spotted a reflection in a mirror that revealed part of an address painted on a wall. The forensic photography team enhanced the image, revealing 347 D Model Town in faded letters. Within hours, police had surrounded the address. The building was a rundown apartment complex where Javed Iqbal had been hiding in a second-floor room under an assumed name. But when officers broke down the door, they found the room empty except for a final letter addressed to the authorities. "You will never take me alive," the letter stated. "I refuse to give society the satisfaction of executing me for my work. I have chosen my own time and method of departure from this world that has never understood my purpose." The letter was dated 2 hours before the police raid. Javed Iqbal had somehow anticipated their arrival and vanished once again. But this time he had left behind fresh evidence of continued criminal activity. The room contained recently taken photographs of new victims, suggesting that his killing spree had continued during his months in hiding. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. While they had been processing evidence of his past crimes, the monster had been creating new victims. The nightmare was still unfolding, and time was running out to prevent further murders. On November 19, 2000, exactly 13 months after the initial discovery at Ravi Road, fate finally intervened in the form of an anonymous telephone tip. A caller reported seeing a man matching Javed Iqbal's description at a small hotel in Lahore's Old City district. Police surrounded the Shalimar Hotel within minutes. This time, there would be no escape. Room 23 on the second floor contained Pakistan's most wanted criminal, but not in the condition anyone had expected. When officers broke through the door, they found Javed Iqbal hanging from a ceiling beam, his body already cold and lifeless. Beside him lay his final victim, a young boy named Sajjad Ali, aged 11, who had been strangled with the same chain the killer had used to end his own life. The scene was both an ending and a beginning, the end of Javed Iqbal's reign of terror, but the beginning of new questions about justice, closure, and the victims who would never see their killer face trial. On the small table beside his body, investigators found his final confession, a 47-page handwritten document that detailed every murder with clinical precision. This ultimate journal entry revealed the full scope of his crimes. 100 children murdered over 7 years, their bodies dissolved in acid, their final moments preserved in photographs and audio recordings for his personal collection. "I have completed my work," the confession concluded. "Society created me through its injustices, and I have responded in kind. These 100 children are my gift to a world that deserves only suffering. Let history remember Javed Iqbal as the man who showed society the consequences of its failures. Even in death, the monster maintained his delusions of righteousness and grandeur. He had robbed society of the chance to see justice served, denied victims' families the satisfaction of witnessing his punishment, and ensured that his story would end on his own terms." The final victim, young Sajjad, had been selling newspapers outside Lahore railway station when Javed Iqbal approached him just 2 days earlier. The boy's father, Mohammed Sharif, had been searching frantically since his son's disappearance. When police informed him of the tragic discovery, his reaction embodied the grief and rage of every parent whose child had fallen prey to the killer. "Even in death, he had to take one more innocent life," Sharif sobbed. "My son was just trying to earn money for school. What kind of monster kills a child and then kills himself to avoid facing justice?" The investigation team processed the hotel room with the same meticulous care they had applied to every other crime scene. They found evidence that Iqbal had been planning this final act for weeks, stockpiling supplies, preparing his confession, and selecting his last victim with the same calculated precision he had applied to all his crimes. Dr. Shaheen's autopsy revealed that Javed Iqbal had died by hanging, using the same chain he had employed to strangle young Sajjad. The killer had apparently murdered the boy first, then positioned his body in a way that would create maximum psychological impact on the discovery team. One final act of cruelty directed at the investigators who had pursued him. The confession document provided law enforcement with previously unknown details about dozens of murders. Names, dates, locations, and methods of disposal were all meticulously recorded in the killer's neat handwriting. This final gift from beyond the grave allowed investigators to provide closure to families who had never known what happened to their missing children. Among the most heartbreaking revelations were descriptions of children who had almost escaped. Several victims had managed to break free from their restraints or slip away from Iqbal's initial capture attempts, only to be recaptured and subjected to even more brutal treatment as punishment for their resistance. Subject number 43 escaped initial restraint and reached the front door before recapture. Read one journal entry. Applied enhanced conditioning protocols as punishment. Subject survived 9 days before termination. Resistance decreases significantly when subjects witness enhanced consequences. The confession also revealed the full scope of Iqbal's disposal methods. In addition to acid dissolution, he had buried some early victims in locations around Lahore, dumped others in rivers, and even fed parts of some bodies to stray dogs to eliminate evidence. The systematic thoroughness of his body disposal methods had allowed him to operate undetected for 7 years. Pakistani authorities found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. The country's worst serial killer was dead, but justice remained incomplete. Families demanded accountability, communities sought closure, and the legal system struggled with how to handle a case where the perpetrator had escaped earthly punishment through suicide. The government announced that Javed Iqbal would be tried posthumously, a symbolic gesture that would allow victims' families to see the evidence presented in court and receive official recognition of their losses. The trial, conducted with an empty defendant's chair, became a cathartic ritual for a traumatized nation. On December 16, 2000, exactly 1 year and 14 days after the discovery of his crimes, Javed Iqbal was posthumously convicted of 100 counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging, the same method he had used to end his own life and escape justice. The judge's final statement resonated through the packed courtroom. While we cannot execute a dead man, we can ensure that his crimes are officially recognized and his victims properly honored. Javed Iqbal died as he lived, as a coward who could not face the consequences of his evil actions. The trial proceedings revealed additional horrors that had not been previously disclosed. Forensic accountants discovered that Iqbal had been selling photographs and videos of his crimes to international collectors of illegal material, generating income from his victims' suffering even as he murdered them. This revelation added a commercial dimension to his crimes that sickened investigators and families alike. He wasn't just killing for personal gratification, explained Detective Inspector Malik during his final testimony. He was profiting from these children's deaths, turning their suffering into a business opportunity. This level of exploitation represents evil in its purest form. The posthumous trial also provided a platform for victims' families to finally speak about their losses. One by one, parents, siblings, and relatives took the stand to describe the children who had been stolen from them. Their testimonies painted pictures of vibrant young lives cut short, children who had dreams of education, who helped support their families, who brought joy and hope to those who loved them. Mrs. Amina Khatun, whose 12-year-old son Rizwan had been murdered in 1998, addressed the empty defendant's chair directly. "You thought you were ending the suffering of street children, but you only created more suffering. Every family you destroyed, every heart you broke, every dream you murdered. These are your true legacy. We will remember our children not as your victims, but as our beloved sons and daughters who deserved so much better than the cruelty you showed them." The psychological impact of Javed Iqbal's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. Child psychologists reported a significant increase in anxiety disorders among children throughout Pakistan. Parents became overprotective, street children faced increased suspicion and isolation, and the nation's collective trust in human decency was permanently scarred. Dr. Saima Ahmed, who counseled many of the victims' families, observed, "The trauma doesn't end with the killer's death. These families will carry their grief forever, and our society will always remember that such evil can exist among us." Healing from this level of betrayal of innocence takes generations, not years. The investigation officially concluded in March 2001, 4 months after Iqbal's suicide. The final report ran to over 3,000 pages and documented every aspect of the case with exhaustive detail. It became a resource for law enforcement agencies worldwide studying serial crime and child predation. Among the report's most significant findings was the identification of systematic failures that had allowed Iqbal to operate undetected for 7 years. Missing children reports were poorly coordinated between jurisdictions, street children lacked adequate protection services, and community awareness of predatory behavior was minimal. This case exposed dangerous gaps in our social safety net, admitted Police Chief Tariq Salim. We have implemented new protocols for missing children investigations, improved coordination between agencies, and established specialized units for crimes against minors. While we cannot undo the harm that was done, we can ensure that future predators will not find it so easy to hunt our children. The Javed Iqbal case prompted legislative changes throughout Pakistan. New laws mandated faster response times for missing children reports, required background checks for adults working with minors, and established harsh penalties for crimes involving the exploitation of street children. The house at 16B Ravi Road was demolished in 2001, its foundation filled with concrete to prevent any possibility of it becoming a macabre tourist attraction. In its place, the government built a small memorial park dedicated to the memory of Iqbal's victims. A simple stone monument bears the inscription, "In memory of 100 innocent children whose lives were stolen, but whose spirits live forever in our hearts." The memorial became a place of pilgrimage for families seeking closure and a reminder to society of the price of ignoring its most vulnerable members. Every year on December 2nd, the anniversary of the discovery of Iqbal's crimes, hundreds of people gather there to light candles and speak the names of children who can no longer speak for themselves. But even after death, Javed Iqbal continued to haunt Pakistan's collective consciousness. His journals and confessions were studied by criminologists, his methods analyzed by law enforcement experts, and his psychological profile examined by mental health professionals seeking to understand how such evil could manifest in human form. The case also sparked international attention about child protection in developing countries. UNICEF and other organizations pointed to Pakistan's experience as evidence of the need for stronger safeguards for street children and more robust missing persons investigation protocols worldwide. In 2005, 5 years after his death, investigators made one final disturbing discovery. While cataloging evidence for permanent storage, they found a previously overlooked hiding place in the Ravi Road house that contained additional photographs and a partial journal suggesting that Javed Iqbal had been planning to expand his operation beyond Pakistan. The journal contained notes about street children in other South Asian countries, observations about law enforcement capabilities in various regions, and what appeared to be preliminary research for establishing killing operations in Bangladesh and Afghanistan. This revelation suggested that his suicide may have prevented an even greater tragedy spanning multiple nations. He wasn't just Pakistan's monster, reflected Dr. Hussain years later. He was potentially a regional threat who might have exported his methods across borders. His death may have saved countless children in other countries from experiencing the same fate as his Pakistani victims. The legacy of Javed Iqbal's crimes continues to influence Pakistan's approach to child protection, criminal investigation, and social services decades after his death. Police academies now include his case in their curricula as a study of investigative persistence and the importance of taking missing children reports seriously. Social workers credit the horror of his crimes with generating public support for street children protection programs that might otherwise have struggled for funding and attention. In a twisted irony, the monster's evil actions ultimately led to improved conditions for the very population he had preyed upon. Today, visitors to Lahore can still feel the shadow of those terrible years when a predator stalked the city's most vulnerable residents. Older residents remember the fear that gripped their community, the helplessness of knowing a killer was among them, and the collective sigh of relief when his reign of terror finally ended. But they also remember the children, 100 innocent souls who deserved protection, love, and the chance to grow into adulthood. Their names are preserved in official records, their faces remembered in family photographs, and their stories told as reminders that every child's life has value and meaning beyond measure. The monster is gone, but the memories remain. Justice may have been cheated by his cowardly suicide, but history will forever record the truth. Javed Iqbal was not a savior or a social reformer or a man driven to desperate measures by society's failures. He was simply evil, a predator who fed on innocence and found satisfaction in the suffering of children. His story serves as an eternal warning about the monsters that can hide among us, wearing masks of respectability while harboring hearts of absolute darkness. The children of Lahore are safer today because his crimes exposed the dangers that lurk in society's shadows. But their safety came at a price too terrible to calculate. 100 children paid that price with their lives, and Pakistan paid it with the permanent loss of a portion of its collective innocence. The case of Javed Iqbal remains a scar on the nation's memory, a reminder that evil exists in the world and that eternal vigilance is the price of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, the only justice for Javed Iqbal's victims lies in ensuring that his story is told, his crimes remembered, and his methods studied so that future predators might be stopped before they can claim innocent lives. The children he murdered cannot be brought back, but their memory can serve as guardians for generations of children yet to come. The nightmare is over, but the lessons it taught must never be forgotten. In remembering the horror of what one man could do, society remembers also its obligation to protect its most vulnerable members and ensure that no child ever again suffers the fate that befell the 100 innocents who fell prey to Pakistan's most notorious monster. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now let's get into our fourth story. Story 4. The Rostov Ripper. The Hunt for Andrei Chikatilo. Deep within the industrial wastelands of Soviet Russia, where smokestacks pierced gray skies and concrete sprawled endlessly across the steppes, a predator stalked his prey with methodical precision. For 12 blood-soaked years, from 1978 to 1990, the shadow of death crept through train stations, wooded groves, and desolate paths. This was not merely a killer. This was a monster who transformed ordinary locations into chambers of unspeakable horror. The forests whispered his name in terror. Railway platforms became hunting grounds where innocence met its violent end. Children vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only anguished families and a trail of carnage that would ultimately claim 53 souls. The Soviet Union, a nation that prided itself on order and control, found itself helpless against a nightmare that defied comprehension. Welcome to the chilling chronicle of Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper, the Red Ripper, the Butcher of Rostov. His story unfolds like a descent into darkness itself, where every chapter reveals new depths of human depravity. The man who appeared ordinary, even scholarly, concealed within his psyche a ravenous appetite for destruction that would terrorize an entire region and expose the cracks in a system desperate to maintain its facade of perfection. This is not just the story of a serial killer. This is the anatomy of evil incarnate, dissected through the lens of one of history's most prolific and savage murderers. Prepare yourself for a journey into the abyss, where sanity dissolves and nightmares become reality. The year was 1936 when darkness first drew breath in the Ukrainian village of Yablok. On October 16th, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo entered a world already steeped in suffering, his first cries echoing across landscapes scarred by Stalin's reign of terror. The very earth seemed cursed. The Holodomor, the man-made famine that devoured millions of Ukrainian souls, had carved hollows in the collective memory that would never heal. Roman Chikatilo, Andrei's father, carried the weight of survival on his shoulders like a millstone. The family had witnessed horrors that defied articulation. Neighbors disappearing into the frozen night, children's bodies discovered in abandoned wells, the gnawing hunger that transformed human beings into desperate shadows of their former selves. Young Andrei absorbed these traumas through his mother's milk, through whispered conversations that died suddenly when adults noticed small ears listening. The boy who would become the Rostov Ripper grew up hearing tales that would have broken stronger minds. His older brother, Stepan, had allegedly fallen victim to cannibals during the famine, though whether this family legend held truth or served as metaphor for their collective trauma remained buried with the dead. What emerged from these early years was a child whose relationship with violence had been forged in the crucible of societal collapse. Anna Chikatilo, Andrei's mother, ruled their household with the iron fist of a woman who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. Her love was a brittle thing, sharpened by years of loss into something that cut rather than comforted. She dominated her son with a mixture of fierce protectiveness and crushing disappointment, never allowing him to forget the weakness she perceived in his gentle nature. Where other mothers might have nurtured, Anna Chikatilo carved expectations into her son's psyche with the precision of a surgeon's blade. School became Andrei's first true battleground, though victory remained eternally beyond his grasp. His myopia, severe enough to blur faces into flesh-colored smudges, marked him as prey among the predators of childhood. The other children sensed something different about this pale, awkward boy who squinted at blackboards and stumbled through playground games. Their cruelty was surgical in its precision. They isolated him with the instinct of wolves culling the weakest member of the pack. The young Chikatilo retreated into books, finding solace in the ordered worlds of literature, where heroes triumphed and justice prevailed. Yet even here, darkness crept through the margins. He gravitated towards stories of violence and conquest, tales where power trampled weakness underfoot. His teachers noted his intelligence but worried about the intensity with which he devoured accounts of historical brutalities. They saw a brilliant mind, but one that seemed to turn its light toward shadows others preferred to leave unexplored. Adolescence brought fresh torments as Andrei's body betrayed him in ways that would echo through his future crimes. His sexual awakening was contaminated by dysfunction, a cruel joke played by genetics or psychology that rendered normal, intimate connections impossible. The shame of this inadequacy ate at him like acid, creating wounds that festered in darkness and silence. Where other teenage boys found release and connection, Andrei discovered only humiliation and rage. The Communist Party became his refuge, offering structure and purpose to a young man adrift in his own inadequacies. Here was an organization that promised order, that transformed individual weakness into collective strength. Chikatilo threw himself into party activities with the fervor of the converted, believing that ideology might provide the sense of power and control that his personal life so cruelly denied him. His academic pursuits led him to Rostov University, where he studied Russian literature and language with the dedication of a monk pursuing enlightenment. The great Russian authors became his companions: Dostoevsky's exploration of criminal psychology, Tolstoy's examinations of moral corruption, Gogol's grotesque character studies. He absorbed their insights into the human condition with an intensity that his professors found both impressive and unsettling. Marriage came to Andrei through arrangement rather than passion, a union designed more for social convenience than emotional fulfillment. Feodosia Odnikiva was a practical woman who saw in this serious young man the promise of stability and respectability. She could not have imagined that she was binding herself to a creature whose inner landscape was slowly transforming into a charnel house of repressed violence and sexual pathology. The birth of their children should have brought joy, but for Chikatilo it only highlighted his growing disconnection from normal human experience. He observed his son and daughter as if they were specimens in a laboratory, feeling the emotions he believed he should experience rather than genuine paternal love. His inability to connect with his own offspring would later manifest in his targeting of children, perhaps an unconscious attempt to destroy what he could never truly possess or understand. Teaching became his profession, placing him in positions of authority over the very demographic that would eventually become his preferred victims. The classroom gave him power, the ability to inspire fear, to control young minds, to shape developing personalities. His students remembered him as strict and unpredictable, a man whose moods could shift from gentle instruction to explosive rage without warning. Yet even as he built the facade of respectability, party member, teacher, husband, father, something malignant was growing in the depths of his psyche. The first signs appeared in his treatment of students, particularly the more vulnerable ones. There were inappropriate touches, lingering stares, comments that crossed the boundaries of professional conduct. Complaints began to surface, whispered at first, then voiced more boldly as patterns became impossible to ignore. The Soviet system, with its emphasis on maintaining appearances and avoiding scandal, enabled Chikatilo's early predatory behavior through willful blindness. Administrators transferred him from school to school rather than confronting the growing evidence of his misconduct. Each move gave him access to fresh victims, new hunting grounds where his reputation had not yet preceded him. The psychological pressure of maintaining his double life, respected educator by day, predator by night, began to manifest in physical symptoms. Headaches plagued him with increasing frequency. His vision problems worsened, and his sleep became populated by dreams that he could never quite remember upon waking, but which left him feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. By the mid-1970s, the transformation was nearly complete. The awkward child had become a dangerous adult, his inadequacies and resentments crystallizing into a worldview where other human beings existed primarily as objects for his use and disposal. The stage was set for the emergence of one of history's most prolific killers, though the world remained blissfully unaware of the monster that was about to emerge from the shadows of Soviet respectability. The final catalyst came in the form of a failed sexual encounter that left Chikatilo humiliated and enraged. Standing in a secluded location, his body trembling with impotent fury, he experienced what he would later describe as a moment of perfect clarity. The shame and anger that had poisoned his existence for decades suddenly crystallized into something far more dangerous. A clear understanding of how he might finally achieve the power and satisfaction that had eluded him throughout his miserable existence. The beast of Rostov was about to be born, and with it would come a reign of terror that would stretch across 12 years and 53 victims. The ordinary man who had been shaped by trauma, inadequacy, and rage was about to discover that in the act of murder, he could find the sense of power and control that had eluded him in every other aspect of his life. The hunt was about to begin. December 22, 1978. The winter darkness wrapped around Rostov-on-Don like a burial shroud, transforming the industrial city into a maze of shadows and frozen breath. Snow crunched underfoot as 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova made her way home from school, her small figure barely visible against the towering apartment blocks that rose like concrete tombstones against the gray sky. She had no way of knowing that she was walking toward an appointment with death itself. Chikatilo had been watching, always watching. His new position at the mining company had given him freedom to roam, to study the patterns of potential victims with the patience of a scientist observing lab rats. The abandoned shack he had discovered near the Grashevka River would become his laboratory, a place where he could conduct experiments in human destruction far from the prying eyes of Soviet authority. The encounter began innocuously enough. A friendly teacher approaching a lost child, offering warmth and assistance. Lena's trust was freely given, as children's trust always is, unmarked by the cynicism that might have saved her life. She followed Chikatilo to his secret place, perhaps believing she was being helped rather than led to slaughter. The innocence in her eyes would haunt investigators for years to come, captured in school photographs that showed a smiling girl who had never imagined that monsters wore human faces. What transpired within those ramshackle walls defied the boundaries of human depravity. Chikatilo's sexual dysfunction, the source of decades of humiliation, transformed into something far more sinister. Where he could not perform as a normal man, he discovered he could achieve gratification through violence. The knife became an extension of his will, each wound an expression of the rage that had festered within him since childhood. The killing was not quick. Chikatilo savored each moment of Lena's terror, feeding on her helplessness like a vampire drawing sustenance from blood. Her screams echoed off the walls of his makeshift chamber, creating a symphony of suffering that awakened something primitive and hungry in his soul. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly powerful, completely in control of another human being's existence. The mutilation that followed revealed the full scope of his sickness. Using a knife he had brought for this specific purpose, Chikatilo began to carve away pieces of his victim's humanity, both literal and metaphorical. The wounds he inflicted served multiple purposes. They satisfied his need for dominance, they eliminated evidence of his sexual inadequacy, and they provided him with a grotesque form of consummation that his broken psychology could accept. Most horrifying of all were the acts of cannibalism that concluded this inaugural murder. Chikatilo consumed portions of his victim's flesh, crossing a line that separated him not just from law-abiding citizens, but from most criminals. This was not mere murder. This was a descent into primordial savagery that transformed a former teacher into something barely recognizable as human. The disposal of Lena's remains demonstrated the methodical nature that would characterize all of Chikatilo's future crimes. He transported pieces of her body to different locations, scattering the evidence across a wide area to confuse investigators and delay identification. Her torso was discovered in the Grashevka River, while other parts were found in various locations throughout the city. The systematic dismemberment revealed a mind that functioned with cold logic even in the grip of homicidal frenzy. The investigation that followed exposed the fundamental weaknesses in Soviet law enforcement's approach to violent crime. The authorities, more concerned with maintaining public order than solving murders, initially treated Lena's death as an isolated incident. The concept of serial murder was largely foreign to Soviet criminology, which held that such Western pathologies could not exist within their ideologically pure society. Detective Alexander Buchanovsky, one of the few investigators who recognized the psychological complexity of the crime, found his theories dismissed by superiors who preferred simpler explanations. His profile of the killer, a sexually dysfunctional individual with deep psychological wounds, was deemed too influenced by bourgeois Western psychology to be taken seriously. The rigid ideological framework of Soviet society became Chikatilo's greatest ally, protecting him through official disbelief. The arrest and execution of Alexander Kravchenko for Lena's murder demonstrated the system's eagerness to close cases rather than solve them. This innocent man died for Chikatilo's crime, his execution serving as a grim punctuation mark to the killer's successful debut. The knowledge that another had paid for his sins with blood must have provided Chikatilo with an intoxicating sense of invulnerability. For 3 years following Lena's murder, Chikatilo remained dormant, like a volcano gathering strength for its next eruption. He returned to his ordinary life, teaching, attending party meetings, maintaining his facade of respectability. Yet the memory of that December night burned within him like a sacred flame, providing warmth during the cold Soviet winters and purpose during the monotonous days of socialist existence. The psychological transformation that occurred during those quiet years was profound. The man who had committed one terrible crime gradually evolved into something far more dangerous, a serial killer refining his methods and expanding his ambitions. He studied police procedures, learned from newspaper accounts of investigations, and began to understand how the system could be manipulated to his advantage. His teaching career provided perfect cover for his evolving predatory instincts. The classroom became a hunting ground where he could observe potential victims, studying their vulnerabilities and weaknesses with the patience of a naturalist cataloging species. The trust that students naturally placed in their instructor became a weapon he wielded with increasing sophistication. The move to Shakhty in 1981 marked the beginning of Chikatilo's true reign of terror. His new position at a technical college gave him even greater freedom to roam, while the anonymity of a fresh location meant he could begin hunting again without the burden of his past reputation. The beast of Rostov was about to emerge from its hibernation, hungry and ready to feed. September 3, 1981, brought Chikatilo's second victim, 17-year-old Larissa Tkachenko. The encounter followed a pattern that would become his signature: an approach at a transportation hub, an offer of assistance or companionship, and a journey to an isolated location where his true nature could emerge. Larissa's youth and vulnerability made her an ideal target for a predator who had spent years perfecting his technique. The murder of Larissa Tkachenko revealed the evolution of Chikatilo's methodology. Where Lena's killing had been frenzied and somewhat disorganized, this second murder showed signs of planning and ritual. He had developed specific patterns of mutilation that satisfied his psychological needs while also serving to confuse investigators. The removal of sexual organs became a signature element, designed both to eliminate evidence of his dysfunction and to fulfill his twisted fantasies of control. The killing spree that followed would transform the Rostov region into a landscape of fear. Between 1981 and 1984, Chikatilo claimed victim after victim, each murder adding to the growing panic that gripped local communities. Parents began to keep their children indoors after dark, travelers avoided isolated areas, and the very atmosphere of the region became poisoned by the knowledge that death stalked the streets. His victims came from all walks of life, though he showed a particular preference for children and young women. The vulnerable, the trusting, the desperate, these became his preferred prey. Runaways sleeping in train stations, children walking home from school, young women traveling alone, all fell victim to his practiced charm and hidden savagery. The geographic spread of his crimes demonstrated Chikatilo's cunning understanding of investigative procedures. By ranging across multiple jurisdictions, he ensured that different police departments would handle different cases, making it difficult for authorities to recognize the connections between murders. His work as a traveling supply clerk provided perfect cover for this mobility, giving him legitimate reasons to be in various locations throughout the region. Each murder refined his technique further. He learned which wounds were most effective at causing death, which methods of restraint prevented victims from escaping, and which disposal methods best confused investigators. The teacher in him appreciated the learning process, treating each killing as a lesson in the perfection of his craft. The psychological gratification he derived from these murders went far beyond mere sexual release. Each victim represented a victory over the shame and inadequacy that had plagued him since childhood. In the moment of killing, he became godlike in his power, holding absolute control over another human being's existence. The intoxication of this power became addictive, driving him to seek increasingly frequent opportunities for its experience. By 1984, the Rostov Ripper had established himself as one of the Soviet Union's most prolific killers, though the authorities remained largely unaware of the scope of his activities. The stage was set for an escalation that would bring him to the attention of the nation's most skilled investigators and begin the long, difficult process of bringing him to justice. The summer of 1984 dawned blood-red over the Rostov region, though few could have predicted the carnage that would soon paint the landscape in literal crimson. Chikatilo had evolved from a tentative killer into something far more terrifying, a methodical harvester of human life who moved through Soviet society like a plague, invisible yet devastatingly effective. His confidence had grown with each successful murder, transforming him into an apex predator who viewed the entire population as potential prey. The railway stations of the Don region became theaters of horror, their platforms and waiting areas transformed into hunting grounds where innocents went to die. Chikatilo understood that these transportation hubs attracted exactly the type of victims he craved: vulnerable individuals traveling alone, often desperate or displaced, people whose disappearances might go unnoticed for crucial hours or even days. The constant flow of humanity provided him with an endless buffet of potential targets. On June 19, 1984, 10-year-old Dmitry Tashnikov became another entry in Chikatilo's growing ledger of death. The boy had been visiting relatives and was waiting for a train home when the killer approached with his practiced smile and rehearsed words of assistance. The abduction was swift and professional, a testament to years of refinement in his technique. What followed in the secluded woodland location defied human comprehension. The mutilation inflicted upon young Dmitry revealed the full flowering of Chikatilo's sadistic imagination. The boy's eyes were carved out with surgical precision, a signature mutilation that would appear in many subsequent murders. This act served multiple psychological purposes for the killer. It eliminated the accusing stare of his victims, it satisfied his need for absolute dominance, and it fulfilled some twisted symbolic need to blind those who might bear witness to his true nature. The removal and consumption of sexual organs continued to be a central element of Chikatilo's ritual. This cannibalistic behavior represented the ultimate expression of his power over his victims, reducing them from human beings to mere meat for his consumption. The act also served to eliminate evidence of his sexual dysfunction, ensuring that investigators would find no traces of the inadequacy that drove his murderous rage. July brought fresh horror with the murder of 16-year-old Lyubov Volobyeva. Her partially clothed body was discovered in a forest clearing, bearing the now familiar pattern of mutilations that marked her as another victim of the Rostov Ripper. The systematic nature of the wounds suggested a killer who had achieved a horrifying level of expertise in the art of human destruction. Each cut served a purpose, Each mutilation fulfilled a specific psychological need. The investigation team, now expanded to include some of the Soviet Union's most experienced detectives, began to recognize patterns that chilled them to their core. The killer was not simply murdering his victims. He was conducting elaborate rituals of domination and consumption that revealed a mind operating on frequencies of evil previously thought impossible. The clinical precision of the mutilations suggested medical knowledge, while the ritualistic elements pointed to deep psychological pathology. Detective Major Mikhail Fedosov, newly assigned to lead the investigation, brought with him a grim determination born from years of confronting human evil. His methodical approach to evidence collection and analysis began to reveal the true scope of the killer's activities. Crime scenes that had previously been treated as isolated incidents were now recognized as part of a vast web of connected murders stretching back nearly 6 years. The summer killing spree continued with relentless intensity. 14-year-old Luba Buryuk disappeared from a crowded market, only to be found days later in a state that defied description. Her body bore the full signature of Chikatilo's pathology: the carved-out eyes, the systematic mutilation of sexual organs, and evidence of partial cannibalism that marked her as another victim of the monster stalking the region. September brought the murder of 9-year-old Alexander Chepel, whose small body was discovered near a railway embankment with wounds so severe that identification became a challenge for forensic specialists. The systematic nature of the child's mutilation revealed a killer who had achieved a terrifying level of comfort with his methods, someone who could perform acts of unimaginable brutality while maintaining the composure necessary to avoid capture. The public's growing awareness of the danger transformed daily life throughout the region. Parents accompanied their children everywhere, train stations employed additional security, and a climate of fear settled over communities like fog rolling in from the Don River. Yet Chikatilo adapted to these changes with the flexibility of a natural predator, adjusting his hunting patterns to exploit new vulnerabilities created by the very measures designed to stop him. His ability to appear normal, even helpful, became his greatest weapon. Witnesses who had seen him with victims described a well-dressed, articulate man who displayed none of the stereotypical characteristics associated with violent criminals. This cognitive dissonance between appearance and reality protected him more effectively than any sophisticated criminal methodology could have managed. The winter of 1984 to 85 brought a temporary lull in the killing, leading some investigators to hope that the murderer had either died or moved to a different region. This optimism proved tragically premature. Chikatilo was simply adapting his methods once again, learning to space his murders more widely to avoid detection while maximizing the psychological impact of each killing. The return of spring coincided with the return of murder. 18-year-old Irina Luchinskaya became another statistic in the growing tally of death, her body discovered in a state that pushed even experienced investigators to their psychological limits. The ritual mutilations had evolved further, becoming more elaborate and more symbolically significant to the killer's twisted worldview. The investigation team's psychological profile of the killer began to crystallize around this time. Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky, a pioneering forensic psychiatrist, developed a comprehensive analysis of the murderer's likely characteristics based on the evidence from crime scenes. His profile described a sexually dysfunctional individual with deep-seated feelings of inadequacy, someone who achieved gratification through the complete domination and destruction of his victims. The profile proved remarkably accurate, describing Chikatilo's age range, educational background, and even his likely profession with stunning precision. However, the Soviet system's suspicion of Western-influenced psychological methods initially limited the profile's impact on the investigation. Traditional detective work remained the preferred approach, even as the body count continued to climb. By mid-1985, the Rostov Ripper had claimed over 30 victims, though investigators were only beginning to connect all the murders to a single perpetrator. The killer's mobility, combined with jurisdictional complications and the Soviet system's reluctance to acknowledge the existence of serial murder, had provided him with nearly perfect camouflage for his activities. The summer of 1985 marked a turning point in both the investigation and Chikatilo's killing career. The murder of 13-year-old Laura Sarkisian was witnessed by several people who provided detailed descriptions of the man seen leading the girl away from a busy street. For the first time, investigators had multiple reliable witnesses and a clear composite sketch of their suspect. The intensified investigation that followed began to tighten the net around Chikatilo, though he remained unaware of the closing trap. His confidence in his abilities had grown to the point of recklessness, and he began taking greater risks in both victim selection and disposal methods. The very success that had sustained him for so many years was beginning to sow the seeds of his eventual downfall. The autumn murders of 1985 demonstrated both the peak of Chikatilo's killing efficiency and the beginning of his tactical errors. The ritualistic elements of his crimes had become so elaborate that they required increasingly longer periods of time with his victims, time that increased his exposure to potential witnesses and evidence collection by investigators. As 1985 drew to a close, the Rostov region remained in the grip of unprecedented fear. The killer, who had begun as an inadequate teacher, had transformed himself into a force of pure evil, claiming lives with mechanical regularity while maintaining the facade of ordinary citizenship that had protected him for so long. The stage was set for the final act of this bloody drama, the intensive manhunt that would eventually bring the Rostov Ripper to justice. The reign of terror was reaching its zenith, but the forces gathering to end it were growing stronger with each passing day. The question was whether justice would prevail before even more innocent lives were lost to the insatiable hunger of the monster stalking the shadows of Soviet society. The year 1986 dawned with fresh determination on the part of Soviet authorities to end the nightmare that had gripped the Rostov region for nearly 8 years. The political implications of the unsolved murders had begun to reach the highest levels of government, threatening to expose fundamental flaws in the socialist system's ability to protect its citizens. What had begun as a local investigation had evolved into a matter of national security and ideological necessity. Major Mikhail Fedosov's investigation team had been reinforced with resources that would have been unimaginable just years earlier. The Soviet Union's most skilled forensic specialists, psychological profilers, and experienced detectives were assembled into a task force whose sole mission was the capture of the Rostov Ripper. The stakes could not have been higher. Failure would represent not just a law enforcement catastrophe, but a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of the Soviet system itself. The breakthrough came through painstaking analysis of transportation records and witness testimony. Investigators had noticed that many of the murders clustered around railway stations and bus terminals, suggesting that the killer was using public transportation to access his hunting grounds. This insight led to the revolutionary decision to place undercover officers at major transportation hubs throughout the region. Dr. Buchanovsky's psychological profile proved instrumental in focusing the investigation. His analysis suggested that the killer was likely an educated man between the ages of 45 and 50, someone whose job provided freedom to travel and whose appearance inspired trust in potential victims. Most importantly, the profile predicted that the killer would be sexually dysfunctional, a detail that would prove crucial in the eventual interrogation process. The surveillance operation that began in late 1986 represented one of the most comprehensive manhunts in Soviet history. Hundreds of officers were deployed across dozens of locations, armed with composite sketches and detailed behavioral profiles. The operation required unprecedented coordination between multiple jurisdictions, breaking down bureaucratic barriers that had previously hampered the investigation. Chikatilo, meanwhile, continued his killing spree with the mechanical regularity that had characterized his methods for years. The murder of 16-year-old Lyubov Golovaka in July 1987 demonstrated that his appetite for violence remained undiminished. Her body, discovered in a forest clearing with the familiar pattern of ritualistic mutilations, served as a grim reminder that the killer remained active and dangerous. The investigation team's analysis of crime scene evidence had evolved significantly by this time. Advanced forensic techniques, borrowed from Western law enforcement agencies despite ideological reservations, provided new insights into the killer's methods and psychology. The systematic nature of the mutilations, the precision of the wounds, and the ritualistic elements all pointed to a highly organized individual who had perfected his technique through years of practice. The autumn of 1988 brought a series of murders that would prove to be among Chikatilo's most savage. 9-year-old Alexei Kobatov was discovered in a state that pushed even experienced investigators beyond their emotional limits. The child's body bore wounds that suggested the killer's pathology had evolved into something even more grotesque than previously imagined. The systematic removal of organs, the precise mutilations, and the evidence of cannibalism created a crime scene that defied rational comprehension. The public pressure on investigators had reached a fever pitch by this time. Parents throughout the region lived in constant fear, newspapers demanded answers, and political authorities began to question whether the Soviet system was capable of protecting its most vulnerable citizens. The failure to capture the killer was becoming a symbol of broader systemic failures that threatened the foundations of socialist society. The turning point came on November 6, 1990, when Chikatilo approached 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik at the Donleskaz railway station. Unknown to him, the station was under surveillance as part of the massive manhunt operation. Plainclothes officers observed the interaction and followed the pair as they left the station together, heading toward a wooded area that had become synonymous with death. The discovery of Svetlana's body the following day provided investigators with their first real-time intelligence about the killer's methods. The crime scene was fresh, the evidence uncontaminated by weather or animal activity, and most importantly, witnesses had observed the perpetrator. The net was finally closing around the Rostov Ripper after more than 12 years of terror. The surveillance footage from the railway station provided investigators with clear images of their suspect. The man captured on camera matched Dr. Buchanovsky's profile with stunning accuracy. Middle-aged, well-dressed, scholarly in appearance, someone who could easily gain the trust of vulnerable individuals. The search for this specific individual became the investigation's primary focus. Chikatilo's arrest on November 20, 1990, occurred under circumstances that reflected both the sophistication of the investigation and the banality of evil itself. He was apprehended while emerging from a wooded area near Donleskaz station, carrying a briefcase and appearing for all the world like an ordinary civil servant heading home from work. Nothing in his appearance or demeanor suggested that he had just committed acts of unimaginable brutality. The initial interrogation revealed the full scope of Chikatilo's crimes in a confession that stunned even experienced investigators. He admitted to 56 murders spanning 12 years, providing details that only the killer could have known. The clinical precision with which he described his methods, the casual manner in which he discussed his victims, and the complete absence of remorse demonstrated a level of psychological pathology that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. The forensic evidence that supported Chikatilo's confession painted a picture of systematic savagery that defied comprehension. DNA analysis, fingerprint evidence, and detailed crime scene reconstruction confirmed his involvement in case after case. The investigation revealed that his actual victim count exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates. 53 confirmed murders with the possibility of additional undiscovered victims. The trial that began in April 1992 became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Russian history. Chikatilo's appearance in court, wild-haired, ranting about persecution, claiming to be a victim himself, provided a stark contrast to the methodical killer described in the evidence. His courtroom behavior alternated between coherent explanations of his crimes and bizarre outbursts that suggested severe mental instability. The testimony provided during the trial revealed the full horror of Chikatilo's methods. Forensic experts described crime scenes in clinical detail, psychologists analyzed the killer's motivations and mental state, and surviving family members confronted the man who had destroyed their lives. The proceedings served as both a quest for justice and a collective exorcism of the evil that had terrorized the region for so long. Dr. Buchanovsky's testimony proved particularly compelling, as he explained how the killer's sexual dysfunction had manifested in increasingly violent behavior. The psychological profile that had seemed theoretical during the investigation was now validated by the living embodiment of its predictions. Chikatilo's own admissions confirmed the accuracy of the analysis that had guided investigators to his capture. The evidence presented during the trial created a comprehensive picture of a killer who had achieved unprecedented levels of brutality and organization. Each murder was methodically documented, each victim remembered and honored, each crime scene reconstructed to demonstrate the systematic nature of the killer's pathology. The proceedings served as both a legal reckoning and a historical record of one of humanity's darkest chapters. The verdict, when it finally came, surprised no one who had followed the case. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was found guilty on 52 counts of murder and sentenced to death. The judgment represented not just legal justice but a symbolic victory for the forces of order over chaos, civilization over savagery, and good over absolute evil. The execution, carried out by a single gunshot to the head on February 14, 1994, brought an end to the life of one of history's most prolific serial killers. With Chikatilo's death, the nightmare that had gripped the Rostov region for more than a decade finally concluded. The man who had transformed ordinary locations into chambers of horror, who had turned human beings into objects for his consumption, who had challenged the very foundations of civilized society, was finally gone. The legacy of the Rostov Ripper case extended far beyond the individual tragedy of 53 murdered victims. The investigation had forced Soviet law enforcement to acknowledge realities about human evil that ideology had previously denied, had introduced Western forensic and psychological techniques into Russian criminal justice, and had demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in confronting crimes that transcended national boundaries. The families of Chikatilo's victims found what closure they could in his execution, though the wounds he had inflicted would never fully heal. The communities he had terrorized began the long process of recovery, gradually reclaiming the spaces he had contaminated with violence and fear. The investigators who had devoted years of their lives to his capture could finally rest, knowing that justice had been served and that the monster who had stalked their region would claim no more innocent lives. Yet questions lingered long after Chikatilo's death. How had one man been able to kill for so many years without detection? What failures in the Soviet system had enabled his reign of terror to continue for more than a decade? Most troubling of all, what other monsters might be lurking in the shadows, hidden by the same institutional blindness that had protected the Rostov Ripper for so long? The case files, sealed for years under Soviet secrecy protocols, eventually revealed the full scope of investigative failures that had prolonged Chikatilo's killing spree. Jurisdictional disputes had prevented information sharing, ideological constraints had limited the use of effective investigative techniques, and bureaucratic incompetence had allowed crucial evidence to be overlooked or misinterpreted. The price of these failures had been paid in the blood of 53 innocent victims. The psychological analysis of Chikatilo's crimes continued long after his execution, as researchers sought to understand how a human being could descend to such depths of depravity. His case became a cornerstone of criminal psychology, studied in universities and law enforcement academies around the world. The insights gained from his pathology contributed to the development of more sophisticated profiling techniques that would help capture future serial killers more quickly and effectively. The transformation of Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo from inadequate teacher to history's most prolific serial killer serves as a chilling reminder of the potential for evil that exists within human nature. His story illuminates the darkest corners of the human psyche, while simultaneously demonstrating the power of dedicated law enforcement professionals to bring even the most cunning predators to justice. The forests around Rostov have grown quiet now, their shadows no longer hiding the specter of violent death. Children walk to school without fear, travelers pass through railway stations without looking over their shoulders, and families sleep peacefully in their beds. The nightmare that was Andrei Chikatilo has ended, but the memory of his crimes serves as an eternal warning about the monsters that walk among us, wearing human faces and speaking human words while harboring inhuman appetites. In the end, the story of the Rostov Ripper is more than just a chronicle of murder and investigation. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable evil, a demonstration of justice's eventual triumph over chaos, and a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are those willing to stand against the darkness and fight for the light. The beast of Rostov is dead, but his victims live on in memory. 53 souls whose lives were cut short by one man's descent into madness. Their names are carved in stone now, their stories preserved in the annals of criminal history, their deaths serving as a warning to future generations about the price of ignoring evil when it first begins to stir. Justice was served, but at a terrible cost. The legacy of Andrei Chikatilo remains as both a cautionary tale and a promise that no matter how long evil may prowl in the shadows, eventually the light will find it, expose it, and ensure that it can never harm the innocent again. The execution of Andrei Chikatilo marked the end of one of the most extensive manhunts in modern history, but the reverberations of his crimes continue to influence criminal justice systems worldwide. His case study remains a cornerstone of forensic psychology, offering insights into the mind of a serial killer that have helped law enforcement agencies develop more effective investigative techniques and prevention strategies. The transformation of Soviet law enforcement practices following the Chikatilo case cannot be overstated. The investigation forced a fundamental reevaluation of everything from crime scene analysis to psychological profiling, introducing Western methodologies that had previously been dismissed as ideologically incompatible with socialist principles. The case became a catalyst for modernizing criminal justice procedures throughout the former Soviet Union. Today, the sites where Chikatilo committed his crimes have been reclaimed by nature and progress. Shopping centers stand where forests once hid his victims. Modern transportation hubs have replaced the dingy stations where he hunted his prey, and new generations have grown up with no memory of the terror that once gripped the region. Yet the lessons learned from those dark years continue to inform our understanding of human evil and our ability to confront it. The story of the Rostov Ripper serves as a stark reminder that monsters do not always announce themselves with obvious signs of madness. They walk among us wearing masks of normalcy, their true nature hidden behind facades of respectability and social acceptance. The price of failing to recognize these predators in time is measured not just in individual tragedies, but in the collective trauma inflicted upon entire communities. As we close this chronicle of one man's descent into absolute evil, we are left with both horror at what humans are capable of inflicting upon one another and hope in our ability to ultimately triumph over such darkness. The investigators who brought Chikatilo to justice, the families who survived his attacks on their loved ones, and the communities that rebuilt themselves after his reign of terror all demonstrate the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. The Rostov Ripper is dead, his victims remembered, and justice served. But the vigilance required to prevent such horrors from recurring can never rest. In every shadow, behind every friendly face, the potential for evil remains. Our defense against such darkness lies not in fear but in awareness, not in paranoia but in preparedness, and not in despair but in the determination to protect the innocent from those who would prey upon them. The beast of Rostov has been vanquished, but the hunt for justice never ends. In memory of the 53 souls whose lives were stolen by Andrei Chikatilo's madness, we must remain forever vigilant against the monsters that walk among us, ready to act when evil shows its face, and committed to ensuring that such horrors are never allowed to flourish again in the darkness of human indifference. This is the final lesson of the Rostov Ripper, that evil triumphs only when good people choose to look away. The price of freedom from such monsters is eternal vigilance, and the cost of failing to pay that price is measured in the blood of the innocent. Never again, never forgotten, never forgiven. If you're still awake, let's move on to our final story. Story 5. The Monster of Charleroi. Deep within Belgium's industrial heartland, where coal-stained streets whisper tales of forgotten dreams, a predator stalked the innocent with calculated precision. Marc Dutroux, a name that would forever scar a nation's consciousness, orchestrated a reign of terror that exposed the darkest corners of human depravity. This monster didn't hunt randomly. He planned, prepared, and executed his crimes with chilling methodology. What unfolded between 1995 and 1996 wasn't merely criminal. It was systematic evil that shook Belgium to its core and revealed failures that continue to haunt investigators decades later. This is the story of how one man's twisted desires created a nightmare that consumed families, destroyed lives, and left an entire country questioning how such horrors could unfold undetected. The autumn of 1995 arrived in Charleroi with an unusual chill, as if nature itself sensed the malevolent force stirring within the city's decaying industrial landscape. Marc-Paul Alain Dutroux, 43 years old, moved through his daily routine with the practiced deception of a seasoned predator. To his neighbors, he appeared unremarkable. A stocky man with thinning hair who operated a small business and lived quietly with his wife Michelle Martin. Yet behind this mundane facade lurked a calculating monster whose twisted fantasies were about to manifest into Belgium's most horrifying criminal reality. Dutrix had spent years perfecting his methodology. His network of properties scattered across the region served not as investments, but as hunting grounds and prisons. Each location had been carefully selected and modified to serve his dark purposes. Hidden chambers, soundproof rooms, and reinforced doors transformed ordinary houses into inescapable nightmares. The most notorious of these lairs sat at 128 Rue de Lavaux in Sars-la-Bessière, a property that would become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The predator's criminal evolution had been gradual but relentless. Earlier convictions for theft and rape had provided him with a blueprint for avoiding detection while escalating his crimes. During his previous imprisonment from 1989 to 1992, Dutrix had not reflected on rehabilitation. Instead, he had refined his techniques and expanded his sick ambitions. His release marked not redemption, but the beginning of his most devastating period of criminal activity. Michelle Martin, his wife and accomplice, represented another crucial element in Dutrix's twisted operation. Far from an innocent bystander, Martin enabled and participated in her husband's crimes with disturbing loyalty. Her role extended beyond mere compliance. She actively assisted in maintaining the properties, managing logistics, and ensuring victims remained concealed from the outside world. The psychological dynamics between the couple revealed a partnership forged in manipulation and sustained by shared complicity in unthinkable acts. By late spring of 1995, Dutrix had begun implementing his most ambitious and horrifying scheme. His targets were carefully selected: young girls who could be abducted without immediate detection, whose disappearances might initially be attributed to running away or other benign explanations. The predator studied patterns, identified vulnerabilities, and waited for optimal opportunities to strike. His patience was that of a hunter who understood that the perfect moment would eventually present itself. The socio-economic landscape of Belgium in the mid-1990s provided Dutrix with numerous advantages. Economic uncertainty had created pockets of instability where children might go missing without immediately triggering comprehensive investigations. The fragmented nature of Belgian law enforcement, divided between federal and local jurisdictions, created communication gaps that a sophisticated criminal could exploit. Dutrix understood these systemic weaknesses and leveraged them with calculated precision. His first major victim of this period was Julie Lejeune, an 8-year-old girl whose radiant smile and trusting nature made her an ideal target for the predator's twisted desires. On June 24, 1995, Julie and her friend Melissa Russo, also 8, disappeared while walking home from a swimming lesson in Grace Holland. The abduction was executed with military precision, swift, silent, and devastating in its efficiency. Within moments, 2 innocent lives had been torn from safety and thrust into a nightmare beyond imagination. The girl's disappearance initially followed predictable patterns. Families contacted police, search parties formed, and communities rallied to find the missing children. However, these efforts were undermined by the very sophistication of Dutrix's operation. His network of safe houses, his understanding of investigative procedures, and his ability to maintain normal appearances while concealing his crimes created a nearly impenetrable shield around his activities. Julie and Melissa found themselves imprisoned in a specially constructed dungeon within Dutrix's property, a space designed not just to contain, but to terrorize. The chamber measured roughly 2 meters by 3 meters, with concrete walls that absorbed screams and eliminated hope of rescue. Ventilation was minimal, lighting virtually non-existent, and the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These children, who had awakened that morning thinking about swimming and summer vacation, now faced a reality so horrific that their young minds struggled to process it. The predator's methodology extended beyond simple imprisonment. Dutrix employed systematic psychological torture designed to break his victims' spirits and ensure complete compliance. Food became a weapon, provided irregularly and in insufficient quantities to maintain both physical weakness and psychological dependence. The isolation was complete, with victims having no contact with the outside world and no indication that rescue efforts were underway. As days turned to weeks, the horror intensified. The girls' families maintained hope, organizing vigils and pleading for information, while their daughters endured unimaginable suffering mere kilometers away. The proximity of salvation to the victim's location would later become one of the case's most heartbreaking revelations. Rescue had been so close, yet remained impossibly distant due to investigative failures and the predator's cunning. Dutrix's treatment of his victims revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance. The abuse wasn't merely physical. It was designed to systematically destroy every aspect of his victim's humanity. The predator understood that complete domination required breaking both body and spirit, and he pursued this goal with methodical cruelty that defied comprehension. The community's growing anxiety about the missing girls provided Dutrix with a perverse satisfaction. He watched news reports about the search efforts, observed the family's anguish, and took pleasure in knowing that his careful planning had created an unsolvable puzzle for investigators. This psychological dimension of his crimes, the deliberate torture of entire communities through uncertainty and fear, demonstrated the comprehensive nature of his evil. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies struggled with limited resources and jurisdictional complications. The initial investigation focused on conventional explanations for the disappearances: family disputes, runaways, or opportunistic crimes. The possibility of a sophisticated, long-term criminal operation managed by a calculating predator was considered but not prioritized, allowing Dutrix additional time to perfect his methods and expand his crimes. The predator's confidence grew with each passing day that his crimes remained undetected. He began planning additional abductions, identifying new targets, and preparing additional facilities to house future victims. What had begun as the fulfillment of sick fantasies was evolving into a criminal enterprise of unprecedented scope and horror. The monster of Charleroi was just beginning to reveal the true extent of his capabilities, and Belgium was about to discover how deeply evil could penetrate the heart of a civilized society. As summer progressed toward its end, 2 innocent girls remained trapped in darkness. Their families clung to diminishing hope, and a predator continued refining his techniques for future atrocities. The first chapter of Belgium's most horrifying criminal case had been written, but the full scope of the nightmare was yet to be revealed. August 1995 brought sweltering heat to Belgium, but within the concrete walls of Dutrix's dungeon, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau knew only the crushing weight of despair. Their captivity had now stretched beyond 2 months, transforming bright summer days into an endless nightmare of abuse, starvation, and psychological torment. The predator had settled into a routine of systematic cruelty that would have broken adults, let alone children who should have been preparing for a new school year. The girls' physical condition deteriorated rapidly under Dutrix's deliberate neglect. Malnutrition became a weapon as effective as any physical restraint, ensuring his victims lacked the strength to attempt escape while maximizing their psychological dependence on their captor for basic survival. The predator understood that hunger could break spirits more effectively than violence, creating a form of learned helplessness that served his twisted purposes perfectly. During this period, Dutrix began expanding his criminal network with calculated precision. His associate Michel Lelivre, a simple-minded individual susceptible to manipulation, became an increasingly important component in the predator's operations. Lelivre's role extended beyond mere assistance. He served as both accomplice and potential scapegoat, allowing Dutrix to maintain plausible deniability while expanding his capacity for coordinated crimes. The relationship between Dutrix and Lelivre revealed the predator's sophisticated understanding of criminal psychology. He identified individuals with specific vulnerabilities, financial desperation, intellectual limitations, or social isolation, and exploited these weaknesses to create a network of complicit individuals who could be controlled through a combination of financial incentives and psychological manipulation. This approach transformed isolated criminal acts into a coordinated enterprise with multiple participants and backup plans. On August 22, 1995, the web of terror expanded dramatically when 17-year-old Marshall and 19-year-old Yves Lambrechts disappeared while camping in West End. These older victims represented an escalation in Dutrix's criminal ambitions, demonstrating his growing confidence and his desire to test his methods against targets who might offer greater resistance. The abduction required more sophisticated planning and execution, revealing the predator's evolution from opportunistic crimes to carefully orchestrated operations. The disappearance of Anne and Yves created a new dimension of horror for Belgian society. Unlike the earlier victims, these were teenagers on the cusp of adulthood, young women with established social networks, romantic relationships, and clear future plans. Their vanishing struck at the heart of parental fears about children transitioning to independence, transforming a basic rite of passage into a source of terror for families across the nation. Dutrix's methodology for handling multiple victims simultaneously revealed his chilling organizational capabilities. The predator had prepared multiple containment facilities, established rotation schedules, and developed systems for managing the complex logistics of concealing numerous captives while maintaining his public facade. This level of operational sophistication suggested years of planning and indicated that his crimes represented not spontaneous acts of violence, but the implementation of carefully developed strategies. The psychological impact on his victims intensified with the presence of multiple captives. Isolation had been replaced by shared suffering, creating complex dynamics where victims might compete for basic necessities or, alternatively, find strength in mutual support. Dutrix understood these psychological variables and manipulated them to maintain control, sometimes pitting victims against each other, and sometimes using their concern for fellow captives as additional leverage for compliance. As autumn approached, the predator's confidence reached dangerous levels. He began making appearances in areas where search efforts were concentrated, deriving perverse satisfaction from his proximity to investigators who remained unaware of his identity. These encounters fed his narcissistic belief in his own invincibility and reinforced his conviction that law enforcement lacked the sophistication necessary to uncover his crimes. The failure of coordinated law enforcement responses during this critical period would later become a source of national shame and institutional reform. Multiple agencies pursued separate leads without effective communication, jurisdictional boundaries created information gaps, and resource limitations prevented comprehensive investigation of suspicious individuals like Dutrix, despite his criminal history and obvious financial resources that exceeded his legitimate income. Meanwhile, the families of all victims endured psychological torture that paralleled the physical suffering of their daughters. Daily uncertainty, false hopes raised and crushed by unsuccessful searches, and the gradual recognition that their children might never return home created trauma that extended far beyond the immediate families to encompass entire communities. The predator's crimes thus victimized not just individuals, but entire social networks. During the final months of 1995, Dutrix's treatment of his captives reached new depths of cruelty. The systematic abuse was designed not merely to satisfy his sick desires, but to completely break down his victim's sense of identity and hope. The predator employed techniques that military interrogators might recognize: sleep deprivation, temperature manipulation, irregular feeding schedules, and constant psychological pressure designed to create total dependence on the captor. The winter months brought additional suffering as heating became another tool of control. The concrete chambers that housed the victims provided no insulation against Belgium's harsh winter weather, and the predator used warmth as another form of psychological leverage. Victims were forced to understand that their most basic human needs, food, warmth, safety, existed entirely at their captor's discretion. By December 1995, the true scope of Dutrix's criminal enterprise began to crystallize. What had appeared to be isolated incidents were revealed as components of a larger operation involving multiple properties, several accomplices, and victims spanning different age groups and geographical regions. The predator had created a criminal infrastructure that could sustain long-term operations while remaining largely invisible to law enforcement agencies. The psychological profile that would later emerge from this period revealed Dutrix as a criminal of exceptional cunning and unprecedented cruelty. His ability to compartmentalize his public and private personas allowed him to maintain normal social relationships while simultaneously orchestrating some of the most horrific crimes in Belgian history. This duality would become a key element in understanding how such extensive criminal activity could remain undetected for so long. The victims who survived this period would later provide testimony that illuminated the methodical nature of their suffering. Every aspect of their captivity had been designed to maximize trauma while ensuring their continued survival for the predator's ongoing abuse. The calculated nature of this cruelty distinguished Dutrix from impulsive criminals and placed him in a category of organized predators whose crimes represent the darkest expressions of human evil. As 1995 drew to a close, The predator's network had claimed multiple victims, traumatized numerous families, and demonstrated the vulnerability of Belgian society to sophisticated criminal operations. The true horror, however, was that this was merely the beginning. Dutrix's appetite for victims was far from satisfied, and his growing confidence suggested that even greater atrocities lay ahead. The monster had perfected his methods, expanded his capabilities, and prepared for an escalation that would soon shock the world. The expanding web of terror had ensnared not just individual victims, but an entire nation's sense of security. Belgium was about to discover that monsters could hide in plain sight, that evil could organize itself with corporate efficiency, and that the protection of innocence required vigilance that had been tragically absent during the predator's reign of terror. The dawn of 1996 brought no relief to the victims trapped within Dutrix's network of underground chambers. Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo had now endured over 6 months of captivity, their young bodies weakened by systematic starvation and their spirits crushed by relentless abuse. The predator's methodical approach to their suffering had transformed these once vibrant children into hollow shells of their former selves, existing in a state of perpetual terror that defied human comprehension. During the early months of 1996, the full extent of Dutrix's sadistic methodology became apparent through his treatment of Marshall and Yves Lambrechts. These older victims presented different challenges and opportunities for the predator, whose approach adapted to exploit their particular vulnerabilities. The psychological torture employed against teenagers differed significantly from techniques used against younger children, revealing the predator's sophisticated understanding of developmental psychology and his ability to customize his cruelty for maximum impact. The predator's daily routine during this period resembled a grotesque parody of normal domestic life. Dutrix maintained his public facade through regular appearances in his community, conducting business transactions, socializing with neighbors, and presenting himself as an unremarkable citizen. This compartmentalization required extraordinary psychological discipline, suggesting a level of mental organization that distinguished him from disorganized criminals and placed him among history's most calculating predators. Michelle Martin's role during this crescendo of horror evolved beyond mere complicity to active participation in the systematic abuse of their captives. Her responsibilities included maintaining the victims' basic survival needs while ensuring they remained physically and psychologically broken. This delicate balance required constant monitoring and adjustment, as the predator needed his victims alive but completely subjugated to his will. The technical aspects of victim management during this period revealed Dutrix's criminal sophistication. He had developed rotation schedules that minimized the risk of discovery while maximizing his access to victims. Soundproofing modifications to his properties ensured that screams and pleas for help never reached potential rescuers. Ventilation systems provided just enough air circulation to sustain life while maintaining the claustrophobic atmosphere that served his psychological purposes. Food became the predator's most effective weapon of control during this phase. Victims received irregular meals consisting of minimal nutrition, calculated to maintain basic bodily functions while preventing any possibility of physical resistance. The psychological impact of this controlled starvation was devastating, creating a dependency relationship where victims' most basic survival instincts became aligned with pleasing their captor. The isolation imposed on victims during the early months of 1996 was absolute and deliberately designed to destroy hope. No contact with the outside world, no indication that search efforts continued, and no sign that rescue might be possible created a psychological environment where victims' sense of time, identity, and future gradually disintegrated. This calculated destruction of hope represented perhaps the most cruel aspect of Dutrix's methodology. As winter gave way to spring, the predator's confidence reached alarming heights. His success in maintaining his criminal enterprise for nearly a year without detection had convinced him of his own invincibility. This hubris would soon manifest in increasingly reckless behavior, but during the early months of 1996, it primarily resulted in escalated abuse and expanded criminal activities. The community impact of the ongoing disappearances had transformed Belgian society's relationship with childhood innocence. Parents who had previously allowed children relative freedom now maintained constant supervision. Schools implemented new security protocols, and entire neighborhoods organized informal surveillance networks. The predator's crimes had succeeded in terrorizing not just his direct victims, but an entire nation's approach to child safety. Law enforcement agencies during this period continued to struggle with the complexity and scope of the investigation. The sophisticated nature of Dutrix's operation exceeded the investigative models typically applied to missing persons cases. His use of multiple properties, coordinated accomplices, and systematic concealment techniques created an investigative challenge that exposed significant limitations in existing police procedures and interagency cooperation. The psychological profiles developed during this phase of the investigation began to suggest the possibility of an organized criminal operation rather than isolated incidents. However, the implications of such a conclusion, that a sophisticated predator could operate with impunity for extended periods while maintaining a normal public appearance, were so disturbing that many investigators resisted accepting this possibility until overwhelming evidence made denial impossible. During the spring months of 1996, the predator's treatment of his victims reached new depths of calculated cruelty. The abuse was no longer merely opportunistic. It had evolved into systematic torture designed to completely destroy his victim's sense of self and humanity. The methodical nature of this suffering revealed Dutrix as a criminal whose evil transcended simple violence to encompass deliberate psychological destruction. The accomplices who enabled Dutrix's crimes during this period demonstrated the predator's ability to corrupt others through a combination of financial incentives, psychological manipulation, and gradual normalization of increasingly horrific acts. This corruption of others represented an additional dimension of his evil, as he succeeded in transforming otherwise ordinary individuals into participants in unspeakable crimes. By the summer of 1996, several of Dutrix's victims had already succumbed to the combination of physical abuse, starvation, and medical neglect that characterized their captivity. Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, the 8-year-old friends whose disappearance had marked the beginning of this reign of terror, had endured over a year of suffering before finally succumbing to starvation and neglect. Their deaths represented not just the loss of innocent life, but the failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. The deaths of Marshall and Yves Lambrechts followed a similar pattern of systematic neglect and abuse. These young women, who had been on the verge of beginning independent adult lives, were reduced to shadows of themselves before finally succumbing to the accumulated trauma of their captivity. Their murders represented the culmination of months of calculated torture, designed to maximize suffering while maintaining the predator's control over their final moments. The disposal of victims' remains revealed another dimension of Dutrix's criminal sophistication. Bodies were concealed using techniques designed to prevent discovery and frustrate forensic investigation. The predator understood that successful concealment of evidence was crucial to maintaining his operation, and he approached this aspect of his crimes with the same methodical planning that characterized all his activities. The psychological impact on surviving victims during this crescendo of horror was devastating and permanent. Those who witnessed the deaths of fellow captives while remaining trapped themselves experienced trauma that transcended individual suffering to encompass survivor guilt, anticipatory fear, and complete psychological breakdown. The predator's ability to orchestrate such comprehensive destruction of human spirits revealed him as a criminal of unprecedented evil. As the summer of 1996 progressed, Dutrix's criminal empire had reached its zenith. Multiple victims had been abducted, tortured, and murdered. Accomplices had been recruited and corrupted, and an entire society had been terrorized by the specter of children disappearing without trace. The predator's success in maintaining this operation for over a year demonstrated both his criminal sophistication and the tragic inadequacies of existing protective systems. The crescendo of horror that characterized this period would soon give way to the predator's ultimate downfall, but not before additional victims had been claimed and additional families had been destroyed. The monster of Charleroi had achieved his most terrible ambitions, creating a legacy of suffering that would haunt Belgium for generations and expose the darkest possibilities of organized evil operating within civilized society. The predator's reign of terror began its inexorable collapse on May 28, 1996, when 14-year-old Sabine Dardenne vanished while cycling to school in Tournai. This abduction, executed with the same calculated precision that had characterized Dutrix's previous crimes, would ironically become the catalyst for his ultimate downfall. The predator's confidence had reached such dangerous heights that he failed to recognize how his escalating activities were finally creating patterns that even fragmented law enforcement agencies could no longer ignore. Sabine's disappearance differed from previous abductions in several crucial respects. Her family's immediate and comprehensive response to her disappearance, combined with the extensive media coverage generated by the accumulating missing persons cases, created unprecedented public pressure for investigative success. The Belgian public had reached a breaking point. The specter of children vanishing into thin air had created a social crisis that demanded resolution regardless of the resources required. Within Dutrix's dungeon network, Sabine joined the ranks of victims whose suffering defied human comprehension. However, her youth and resilience, combined with the predator's growing carelessness, would prove crucial to the eventual exposure of his crimes. The systematic abuse that had destroyed previous victims was applied with the same methodical cruelty. But this time, circumstances were aligning against the predator's continued success. The investigation that would finally unravel Dutrix's criminal empire began not with sophisticated police work, but with a seemingly unrelated incident involving stolen vehicles. This mundane criminal matter created the first substantial lead that law enforcement agencies had encountered in over a year of fruitless searching. The irony that such extensive and horrific crimes would be exposed through routine police work demonstrated both the predator's overconfidence and the random nature of criminal detection. On August 9, 1996, 12-year-old Letitia Delhez disappeared while walking home from a public swimming pool in Bertrix. This final abduction pushed Dutrix beyond the threshold of sustainable criminal activity. The accumulation of missing children, combined with increased public vigilance and enhanced police coordination, created an investigative environment where even the most careful predator could no longer operate with impunity. Letitia's abduction was witnessed by several individuals who provided descriptions that, when combined with previous witness accounts, began forming a composite picture of the predator and his vehicle. This marked the first time that Dutrix's careful operational security had been significantly compromised, although he remained unaware that his anonymity was finally beginning to deteriorate. The breakthrough came on August 13, 1996, when police investigating the stolen vehicle case identified Dutrix as a suspect worthy of surveillance. This surveillance quickly revealed suspicious activities that elevated him from a minor criminal to a person of interest in the missing children cases. The convergence of multiple investigations created a momentum that would prove unstoppable, despite the predator's sophisticated concealment methods. The arrest of Mark Dutrix on August 13, 1996, marked the beginning of the end of Belgium's most horrific criminal enterprise. However, the predator's capture represented only the first step in unraveling a network of crimes that had traumatized an entire nation. The initial charges related to vehicle theft provided investigators with the legal framework necessary to begin exploring the deeper implications of Dutrix's criminal activities. The discovery of Sabine Dardenne and Letitia Delhez alive in Dutrix's Charleroi property on August 15, 1996, provided the first concrete evidence of the predator's involvement in the missing children cases. These survivors, though severely traumatized, could provide testimony that would prove crucial in understanding the full scope of Dutrix's crimes and the systematic nature of his abuse. Sabine's survival represented both a miracle and a testament to human resilience under the most extreme circumstances. Her ability to maintain some degree of psychological integrity despite months of systematic abuse provided investigators with insights into the predator's methods, while offering hope that justice might finally be achieved for all his victims. The search of Dutrix's properties revealed the true horror of his criminal enterprise. Hidden chambers, torture devices, and evidence of systematic abuse painted a picture of evil that exceeded investigators' worst expectations. The discovery of victims' remains provided definitive proof of murders that had been suspected but never confirmed, transforming missing persons cases into homicide investigations of unprecedented complexity. The recovery of Julie Lejeune's and Melissa Rousseau's bodies from Dutrix's property marked one of the investigation's most heartbreaking moments. These children, who had disappeared over a year earlier, had been buried on the predator's property after succumbing to starvation and neglect. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but systemic failures that had allowed a predator to operate with impunity for extended periods. The subsequent discovery of Marchel's and Yves Lambrec's remains revealed the full scope of Dutrix's criminal network. These victims had been transported between multiple properties before their deaths, demonstrating the sophisticated logistics that the predator had developed to manage his expanding criminal enterprise. Their murders revealed a level of criminal organization that challenged existing understanding of serial predation. The arrest and prosecution of Dutrix's accomplices revealed the extensive network that had enabled his crimes. Michel Martin, Michel Lelivre, and others were charged with varying degrees of complicity, illustrating how the predator had succeeded in corrupting multiple individuals to serve his criminal purposes. The psychological manipulation that had created these accomplices became a crucial element in understanding how such extensive crimes could remain concealed. The investigation's expansion revealed additional properties, additional evidence, and additional victims whose suffering had previously been unknown. The true scope of Dutrix's crimes extended far beyond the headline cases to encompass years of criminal activity that had affected numerous families across Belgium and neighboring countries. The public reaction to the revelations about Dutrix's crimes was unprecedented in Belgian history. Massive demonstrations demanded justice for victims and accountability for the investigative failures that had allowed the predator to operate for so long. The White March of October 1996 brought over 300,000 people to Brussels, demonstrating the depth of public outrage and the demand for systematic reform of child protection systems. The judicial proceedings that followed Dutrix's arrest revealed both the strength and limitations of Belgium's legal system when confronted with crimes of such magnitude. The complexity of prosecuting multiple murders, sexual abuse cases, and conspiracy charges created legal challenges that required years to resolve while maintaining public confidence in the justice system. The trial process, which extended over several years, provided a platform for survivors to testify about their experiences while ensuring that the full scope of Dutrix's crimes was documented for historical record. This testimony, though difficult for survivors and their families, proved crucial in achieving convictions and providing closure for affected communities. The eventual conviction of Marc Dutrix on charges of murder, kidnapping, and sexual abuse resulted in a life sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and society's determination to ensure he could never again threaten innocent lives. The sentences imposed on his accomplices varied according to their degree of complicity, establishing legal precedents for future cases involving criminal networks. The systemic reforms implemented in response to the Dutrix case transformed Belgium's approach to child protection and criminal investigation. Enhanced coordination between law enforcement agencies, improved missing persons procedures, and strengthened legal frameworks for prosecuting complex crimes represented attempts to prevent future tragedies of similar magnitude. The legacy of the Dutrix case extends far beyond Belgium's borders, influencing international cooperation in combating child exploitation and establishing protocols for investigating crimes involving organized predation. The case demonstrated that evil of such magnitude requires coordinated international responses that transcend traditional jurisdictional boundaries. For the families of victims, the conclusion of legal proceedings provided some measure of closure while highlighting the permanent nature of their losses. The children who died during Dutrix's reign of terror would never experience the lives that were stolen from them, and their families would forever bear the scars of their suffering. The survivors of Dutrix's crimes faced the challenge of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by systematic trauma. Their courage in testifying and their resilience in recovery provided inspiration for other survivors while demonstrating the human capacity to endure and overcome even the most extreme evil. The monster of Charleroi had finally been caged, his network dismantled, and his reign of terror ended. However, the scars left by his crimes would remain forever etched in Belgium's collective memory, serving as a permanent reminder of the vigilance required to protect innocence and the terrible consequences when such vigilance fails. The case of Marc Dutrix stands as one of history's most comprehensive examples of organized criminal predation and its impact on society. His systematic approach to victim selection, abuse, and concealment revealed possibilities for evil that few had previously imagined, while his eventual capture and conviction demonstrated that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail against even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The name Marc Dutrix remains synonymous with the darkest capabilities of human evil. His crimes claimed the lives of at least 4 children, traumatized survivors for life, and exposed systematic failures in child protection that reverberated throughout Belgium and beyond. The case transformed not just criminal investigation procedures, but society's understanding of how organized predators operate and the vigilance required to protect the innocent. Today, the victims are remembered not just for how they died, but for the lives they might have lived. Their memory serves as both a tribute to their innocent spirits and a permanent reminder of the price of complacency in protecting society's most vulnerable members. The monster has been caged, but the lessons of his crimes must never be forgotten. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.